Yes.
Welcome to this public meeting of the Geographical and Geospatial Sciences Committee of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I'm Kristen Curlin, Chair of the GGSC. We're glad to have you with us in the room, watching the webcast, or viewing the recording of the session at a later time. Before we begin, I want to say just a few words about the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and the Geographical and Geospatial Sciences Committee. Next slide. The National Academies are private, nonprofit organizations that provide objective, independent advice on science, technology, engineering, and medicine. The National Academies were established at the direction of President Lincoln and have been providing these services to the country for over 150 years. They draw upon the expertise of volunteers to inform policy with evidence, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. Next slide, please. The Geographical and Geospatial Sciences Committee is a standing committee of the National Academies. It provides a forum for innovative scientific, technical, and policy discussions on geographic theory and knowledge, geospatial data, mapping and spatial analysis, and the applications of these theories, knowledge, and methods to society's most pressing challenges. Next slide, please. Our current membership is comprised of 5 volunteers from across the United States with expertise in physical, human, and economic geography, geospatial data analysis, computation, spatial science, human mobility, climate change, and natural hazards. The members are Hendrik Hamann, Marguerite Madden, Keith Masbach, Elizabeth Root, and myself. The committee is supported by funding from the National Sciences Foundation, the U.S. Census Bureau, and the U.S. Geological Survey. Next slide, please. The title of our meeting is Evolving Geodigital Data, Opportunities, Challenges, and Disruptions. This meeting will explore what constitutes authoritative geospatial data and how it relates to geospatial data that federal agencies manage. Our program today will consist of 3 main sessions, and we will have time for Q&A after each session. For committee members and speakers in the room and on Zoom, please use the raise hand function on Zoom to indicate that you would like to ask a question. For those watching the webinar, you may submit your questions via Slido. There should be a Slido Q&A box embedded at the meeting webpage and also a link shared with the Zoom webinar. Please note that the webinar is being recorded and understand that any questions you submit may be read aloud and included in the recording. A link to the recording will be posted on the meeting webpage shortly after the meeting. Now, I'd like to hand things over to GGSC member Elizabeth Root, who will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, this afternoon. For our keynote session, Kevin Pomfret will discuss legal considerations for geospatial data and how to build trust. Then we will hear insights and discussion from Christine Hirschkorn and Nicholas Hanowski. I will briefly introduce each of these speakers at the beginning of their talks. Kevin Pomfret is a partner at Williams Mullen Law Firm, where he represents a wide range of public and privately held companies in a variety of corporate matters. Kevin serves as chair of Williams Mullen's Unmanned Systems and as co-chair of the Data Protection and Cybersecurity teams. As a former satellite imagery analyst, Kevin is also a thought leader in geospatial technology with almost 30 years of experience in the geospatial community. He has helped companies apply and receive commercial remote sensing licenses from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and he counsels companies in a variety of geospatial industries, including drones, mapping companies, sensor manufacturers, and cloud and software providers. Kevin, if you would, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for the National Academies for the opportunity to give this keynote. It's an honor to be here with so many dedicated professionals who understand the power of geospatial data in today's society. Today, I want to talk about a critical but often overlooked aspect of our work, trust. Specifically, how can we build and maintain trust in geospatial information And what lessons can we draw from other domains where trust is built into the very systems that support our daily lives? When you think about trust, think about your morning routine. You eat breakfast without testing your food. You drive to work on roads maintained by people you will never meet. You walk into buildings without wondering whether the roof will collapse. Why? Because you trust that the systems behind these things are functioning, that someone has ensured that they are safe. Today, I want to use these three familiar domains, food, transportation, infrastructure, to explore how trust is engineered through laws, regulations, policies, and contract. And then we will examine what this means for the geospatial community. So let's begin with breakfast. When you pour a glass of juice, when you toast your bread, or when you crack an egg, you don't run lab tests to make sure that they're safe. Why? Because there is an intricate system of laws and regulations behind that. The FDA oversees most packaged foods under the Food Safety Modernization Act. The USDA inspects meat and poultry under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. State and local departments of health inspect grocery stores, food carts, and warehouses. Tort law and strict liability law ensures companies have a legal and financial incentive to keep food safe. Contracts between suppliers, distributors, and retailers specify food safety requirements and allocate risk. What's important here is that trust is not based on blind faith. It's based on an interlocking set of frameworks that impose standards, verify compliance, and allocate responsibility between the parties. So now think about your drive to work, or my drive down here this afternoon. My car, the road, the traffic lights, none of them are left to chance. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration ensures the federal motor vehicle safety standards ensure airbags and brakes and tires are reliable. The Federal Highway Administration partners with states to maintain roads, while states enforce traffic laws, conduct vehicle inspections, and regulate insurance requirements. State DMVs make sure that you have your license, and they allocate violations and track those. Private contracts govern everything from your car lease to your insurance requirements. Every part of your commute is governed by rules, supported by technology, but also enforced by regulators and subject to private legal mechanisms that keep people accountable. Again, trust here is not abstract, it's structured. Now think about when you walked into this building. The building had to meet local building codes when it was contracted. It was inspected for fire safety, it was inspected for structural integrity, ADA accessibility, and many more aspects. The systems inside, the elevators, the HVACs, the security, they're all regulated by industry standards, but also local ordinances and occupational safety laws like OSHA. If you lease an office, you're protected by commercial lease contract that specifies who is responsible for repairs, who's liable, and who's responsible for our maintenance. And once you're inside, employment law ensures that your employer provides a safe working environment. You trust the building because many layers of law, policy, and contract have done the work of protecting you. In comparison are those in the geospatial community who comment about drivers who get lost, stuck, and in some tragic instances killed due to reliance on sat-nav devices. I've heard on a number of occasions that drivers should know better and should always carry a map and not assume that the voice telling you to take a left at the next light is correct. My response is when a product is put into the marketplace, consumers should be able to expect that it works. When I buy a car, I don't throw a bike in the trunk because I'm worried it's going to break down. So a number of years ago, I created this term geospatial law because after practicing for a number of years, I noted that there are unique legal issues associated with geospatial information and technology. These included intellectual property because of the limited copyright protection associated with facts, licensing because most licenses were created for software, not for data, particularly geospatial information, and so they were not really suited. Privacy because of the power of geospatial and the difficulties fitting the way location information is collected with the existing privacy and data protection constructs. Liability because of the versatility of geospatial information. Data sets can be used for a variety of applications, but they may not be suited for those applications. They may not be precise, accurate, complete, or timely for that. And then national security. A lot of the geospatial technologies came out of in some way through the defense and military and intelligence community. So there's this dual use capability that today in the US and across the globe, there are always national security concerns associated with geospatial information and geospatial technology. In my experience, the geospatial community would prefer to focus on ethics, policies, and best practices rather than on legal and regulatory issues. But these discussions, in my opinion, are simply just the geospatial community talking to itself. For example, I have noted on a number of occasions that when I go to a conference in other technologies, such as space or drones, there's at least one, and often more, panels involving lawyers talking about the state of the law and where things are going and what's impacting the technology. It wasn't until this year that I was able to get a sponsor of or a host of a geospatial conference to have a legal panel at two of his conferences. In his defense, not many people came to either panel, which is again part of the problem, right? Last week, I was at a meeting here in DC. I was the only lawyer at this meeting, and we had geospatial experts from around the US. And even though the read-ahead materials were from a law journal, and a lot of the discussion concerned liability issues, one of the members, very well respected in the geospatial community, and I like him, turned to me and said, the lawyers should not be brought in until the technologists and the engineers have decided what they're going to do. So I responded, I said, that's fine, but then don't blame the lawyers when they tell you that they need time to consider all the potential legal challenges associated with what you want to do. And I had a similar experience on LinkedIn today where someone was up at a Earth observation conference in New York and was complaining about licensing in lawyers and how long it was taking. Now, ironically, at that time, I was looking at a multi-page license agreement for a software product that I couldn't get my head around. But for some reason in the software world, that's accepted. But in the data geospatial world, it's still frowned on. But the point is that we don't want to have lawyers make it too complicated. But in my opinion, it is as if a group of lawyers got together and developed software code and then got mad when a software engineer told them it wouldn't work. Some of you may have heard me say before, source code and legal code are both very complex, but people think that legal code is easier to understand because of the language that's used. I believe that one of the reasons that the geospatial community has not appreciated the extent of the legal issues that they're facing is because most of them are tied to data. To put it another way, the geospatial community, in my opinion, was big data before big data was cool. And there were not many who understood data well enough to advise on the potential legal implications. But now the legal and regulatory communities are beginning to focus on these issues. And the resulting laws and regulations will have a significant impact on the geospatial community. It started with concerns over data protection and privacy. And Andrew and I were talking about 15 years ago, I was talking about the concerns associated with privacy and was warning that there'd be federal laws. That hasn't happened yet, and we can talk about reasons why Congress hasn't done that, but the states are starting to do it. And they're starting to see enforcement actions at the state level regarding location information, and I think you can expect to see more. Then growing concerns around cybersecurity, around data that's being protected, and we're seeing the government paying more concerns about that. Now the focus is on AI. Many of the legal issues associated with AI currently being litigated in courts or debated in legislatures, such as intellectual property rights, privacy, liability issues, national security, and data sovereignty, have significant overlap with geospatial information. In fact, I would argue that geospatial information makes these issues even more complex in an AI context. So the systems we trust, our foods, our buildings, our roads, are not inherently trustworthy. They are engineered to be so through laws, regulation, and contracts, in addition to what we talk about in this community in ethics and standards and best practices. So what can the geospatial community do to begin to fostering the same level of trust? I believe there are three things. First, better understand the legal issues that impact the collection, use, storage, and distribution of geospatial information. I can't tell you how many times people have told me that geospatial information is not personally identifiable information, or PII, and therefore there are no privacy concerns. PII, the concept of PII as a privacy concern is very much outdated. The laws have changed quite a bit. I've also heard, and we have in the meeting I was in last week, said, well, you don't have an expectation of privacy in public spaces. That too is beginning to change. Principles have started to change in that at the federal and the state level. Just the other day, I spoke to a CEO of a company in Europe building GeoAI solutions. He did not know what the EU AI Act was. The law is changing, and it is critical to keep up with what is happening. Otherwise, you run the risk of developing products and services that will become prohibited or too expensive to deploy because of the compliance requirements. Second, I think that the geospatial community needs to engage more in the legal and policy discussions that are taking place on matters such as AI, data sovereignty, cybersecurity, and privacy. These discussions are taking place at all levels of government, but from what I can tell, there's very little geospatial participation in them. Yet the results will have a direct impact on the geospatial sector. And I can promise you that no one else at that table will have a better understanding of the value of location or the complexity of the geospatial ecosystem. So without a seat at that table, there is a strong chance that laws and regulations will be developed that will have a negative impact on geospatial. Going back to the point I made earlier, I've been saying for 15 years, Andrew, and I continue to believe that that is the case. Finally, the third point, understand your master services agreements, your terms of use, your license, your vendor contracts, and other agreements. When I first started practicing law, with very few exceptions, contracts for goods and services were pretty standard. However, in the digital world, that has changed significantly. Some agreements are still relatively risk-free, but others are the lifeblood of many software and technology companies, including geospatial companies. For example, in my opinion, an end-user license agreement in the geospatial information context is a manifestation of an organization's business plan. However, I have found too few business leaders focus on the terms of these agreements other than payment terms and intellectual property rights. These agreements are often put off until the very end of a transaction, as a speaker at the conference last week suggested, and the lawyer is then asked to draft or review them very quickly so the deal can close or a product can be released. And often asked to make it as few pages as possible so that no one has to read too much. Don't make it too complicated. But it is complicated. These agreements contain provisions on liability, privacy, insurance, cybersecurity, and they're allocating the risk between the parties on those matters. And they're increasingly important to understand how these are being allocated, and they go to trust. For example, the geospatial community often talks about authoritative data. But I don't know of any organization, or very few, that will represent in an agreement that their data is sufficiently accurate, timely, precise, or complete for the action, or that it's fit for purpose. People have told me on several occasions that the geospatial community does not want to focus on the legal and regulatory issues because they think it will hurt business or hurt operations. I flip it around. I suggest to you that the opposite is true, that by helping develop a legal and policy framework that addresses the unique attributes of geospatial information, the geospatial community will foster trust and enhance the value and benefit of this important sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for giving us such a great stage-setting presentation. We have now two additional discussants who we will hear insights and discussion from, Christine Hirschkorn and Nicholas Hanowski. First, I'll introduce Christine. Since 2021, Christine Hirschkorn has been the co-chair of the Working Group on Policy and Legal Frameworks for the Geospatial Information Management under the United Nations Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management. That's UNGGIM. The working group has produced a range of publications and resources addressing policy and legal considerations, including exploring the notions of authoritative data, trust, and the public good. Christine also leads a strategic policy and leadership team at the Canada Centre for Mapping and Earth Observation, Natural Resources Canada, Government of Canada. So thank you for joining us, Christine, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you, Kevin, for your remarks. As usual, you have a very direct and succinct way of problematizing the situation. Just a question, am I to share my slides or is someone able to share them on your end? I just have a couple to run through.
You can share if you'd like, but we also have them here and Maya can share them for you. You can just tell her to advance if you'd rather.
Okay, so you can go ahead and share the slides anytime while I make a few introductory points. So I'm speaking on behalf of the UN GJM Policy and Legal Frameworks Working Group. You can proceed to the next slide, please. I also want to just acknowledge, previous slide, thank you. Yeah, and I would like to acknowledge that my co-chair is Mr. Asim Al-Ghamdi from Saudi Arabia. And you'll notice I also have Madeline Martin and Inyas Kabaiza listed on the slide. They are also working group members who led the development of some of the resources that are featured in these following slides. And they are also, I believe, in attendance virtually today. So the next couple of slides will, or pardon me, let me just back up. The objective of our UN GJM working group is to identify the policy and legal considerations and policy and legal tools available to governments to address some of the concerns that Kevin, for example, has raised. So the next couple of slides will introduce some of our work that relates to the concepts of authoritativeness and trust. And our starting point from a government perspective is the public good. Governments as representatives are responsible to facilitate the realization of the public good, which involves balancing the various interests and stakeholders in fairness and with due process. And so consistent with this notion of the public good, we often refer to the importance of a robust policy and legal framework as a foundation for trust in the use of geospatial data and emerging technologies. And of course, a robust policy and legal frameworks includes those components that, for example, like Kevin has already listed, addressing matters of privacy, confidentiality, security, etc. Next slide, please. So our working group proposes that the notion of fit for purpose is key to support transparency and establish trust in authoritative data. So if a government or organization designates or brands data as authoritative for a specified purpose, this means that data governance is in place to provide assurance that the data is suitable for its intended purpose and has the desired characteristics and/or required legal status. The chosen principles for any given data purpose guide the process and the governance to deliver on the intent for the data. You'll see that this decision tree distinguishes between data with legal status and purposes versus data for other purposes. Next slide, please. We would also say that the preconditions for trust, in this case of governments, are based on the robustness and transparency of policy and legal instruments, which we depict along a continuum between the endpoints of control and trust. Some examples of types of instruments are provided on the continuum. On the control end, on the left, oversight of authoritative data is tightly or precisely regulated. On the trust end of this continuum, oversight of authoritative data is based on more informal, non-regulatory instruments. It may also be helpful to think about the different actors or partners involved in oversight of authoritative data. For example, laws and regulations are top-down government-driven instruments, whereas negotiated multilateral arrangements such as MOUs and partnerships are horizontal in nature. Increasingly, some governments are adopting these negotiated multilateral collaborative approaches. Next slide. So in conclusion, we would just simply say that the public good perspective involves the intentional development and maintenance of transparent processes and procedures anchored in legal and policy instruments as a basis for trust. And I would say this dovetails very well with Kevin's remarks about how you trust something on account of the robust processes, frameworks, standards that are behind the things we encounter every day, and in this case, geospatial information. On this slide, you'll see a range of resources that our working group has developed. For example, the first one was developed by Kevin, a policy and legal resource kit. And you can access these on the UN GJM website. And as a final note, to kind of follow up on Kevin's note about the importance of involving your legal folks as you proceed, we would also say that we would underscore and emphasize the need for the geospatial legal and policy communities to be in communication early and in an ongoing way. And we very much appreciate the opportunity to present here, and we would encourage you all to speak with your legal folks and bring them along to your geospatial meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. I'd like to now introduce our second discussant. Nicholas Hanowski started as a researcher in the US and then transferred to mission operations at the German Space Operations Center. In 2009, he became responsible for the development of science ground segments for missions such as Rosetta, Gaia, JWST, Solar Orbiter, and Euclid at ESA. Since 2014, he is responsible for the operations and ground segments of the ESA, Earth Explorers, and the Copernicus Sentinel satellites, and the corresponding data management aspects at the ESA. So I'd like to welcome Nicholas. Over to you.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. This is Nicholas. Many greetings from Europe. I'm talking to you from Rome in Italy. And I would like to give you a few comments, a few words on the issue of building trust. Let me start by sending a special greeting to my friends from NASA and IBM that are sitting in the room. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you on the issue of trust. I only have a single slide that you're looking at, and I will try to illustrate a little bit the notion of trust from the angle of the European Space Agency Earth Observation Directorate, to contribute a little bit to this session here. So let me start by just emphasizing a little bit the role of Earth observation for the European Space Agency. Space Agency is
Nicholas, you're popping in and out.
Organization. We are not the European Union. We have Canada are members of the European Space Agency, a quite distinct body. A little bit closer. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you were popping in and out. You seem to be okay now. So,
okay,
but we lost you shortly after you introduced yourself.
Okay, sorry. Then let me try to keep it really short and to the point. The European Space Agency is an international organization comprised of a very distinguished set of member states, which is quite distinct from the European Union. So we have United Kingdom, we have Norway, we have Switzerland, Canada, which all are not members of the European Union. But our program is deeply linked with the European Union. And at the core of our program is the Copernicus program that you see represented here in the middle. And you're probably aware of some of our satellites of this program. The Copernicus Sentinels are the backbone of what we call our operational contribution to Earth observation, to the Earth observation data ecosystem. But this program is embedded in two layers. We have a program that is focusing on advanced technologies never flown in space for Earth observation, which is our science program, and it is comprised of missions such as Aeolus, Biomass, EarthCare. These are missions with instruments and sensors that have never flown before. And they are also bracketed by our meteorology program, missions that contribute to meteorological data, which is run by the European Organization for Meteorological Satellites, EUMETSAT, which is located in Germany. So these are the programmatic key elements and also the key infrastructures that we are having in space. And the question that I'm trying to address here is, how do we build trust, and which role does trust play in the utilization of these infrastructures. And the first point of my list that I would like to make is the message of continuity. From our perspective, the world in Earth observation, and in that sense also for geospatial, has changed from the era of what I would call specific, either commercial or scientific missions that were dedicated to specific objectives and specific communities towards a broader utilization landscape. This transition happened about 10 years ago, and it started with the advent of Copernicus, and it's exemplified by the data policy that Copernicus constitutes, and by the way, also the science missions of the European Space Agency, which is a completely free and open data policy, meaning that we consider Earth observation data from space, from all of these satellites, as a free and open commodity, to be downloadable, to be accessible from very different points. And in that sense, also data sets that, depending on where you download them or where you access them, have a different context. For us, from a policy and also from a investment perspective, a free and open data policy only makes sense if we can materialize certain advantages by being the operator of the system. And the immediate advantages that in terms of trust building are in our hands is the issue of operational robustness. So the ability to determine the timeliness, the completeness of the data being accessible to the users, but also in terms of data quality, for example, and data authenticity. So these are all qualities of the data sets that over time and in terms of continuity, of their continuous availability, are the key factor in trust building. There are many ways to declare a system operational, to declare a system trustworthy. But in the end, what really counts is what we call operational continuity. There's a second element that I would like to stress as a trust builder from our perspective, beyond the simple continuity of these qualities of data access and data provision, which is the connectivity of the data sets. In the Copernicus program where you see the satellites in the middle, there's a certain relationship and a certain interusability of the system. Each Sentinel family, Sentinel-1, for example, for radar, C-band radar, or Sentinel-2 for multispectral, is comprised of several satellites which act as a system. And beyond this interaction within the system, we are also endeavoring to connect the systems in terms of usability in what we call a data access ecosystem, where the usability, where the tools for utilizing and transforming data into information is designed in a way that we can harness the value of the satellites, not only within a family, but beyond the family, between different families of Copernicus. And we are even going a step further, where we say we want to illustrate that even from a perspective of pure scientific missions, and remember that I described these scientific missions as pioneering in terms of instrumentation and technology that has never been flown in space before, we see a equivalent transition, equivalent paradigm shift to what I described in terms of continuity and a broad user provision for the Copernicus system or the overall Earth observation ecosystem. This second paradigm shift is that we see what used to be pure scientific applications to become really operationally viable, interesting, and usable, to the level that some of the Earth Explorer data of the science program that you see on the left here are actually becoming part of commercial products. So the boundary lines between what we would call scientific domain, the operational Copernicus domain, and even the meteorology domain are softening, are blurring, and we see interactions. And we are fostering that interaction deliberately in the spirit of what I call the connectivity element of trust building. And then the final element of trust building from our perspective is the commitment, the long-term commitment of the institutions behind these programs. So again, as I started to describe the European Space Agency with its 23 member states, and the fact that the Copernicus program is owned by the European Union shows you already this programmatic links between the big political institutions in Europe with their corresponding programmatic planning cycles. And it's that commitment to long-term programmatic planning on the east.
Nicholas, I'm afraid we lost you again. Maybe if we turn your video off.
Sorry.
There you are. You're back. We can see you again.
Okay. Thank you. Becoming part of the European long-term political programmatic perspective. I think that's the key message. So to keep it really short, let me just repeat the 3 C's. So it's the intention of continuity in terms of accessibility, quality, timeliness, and all the parameters that we control as the operators of the system. This idea of connectivity between the different domains of missions, which is strengthening the synergies and the reliability of the system that we intend to build trust on, and what I would call the political and programmatic commitment in Europe to maintain these systems for the European Space Agency. And this is my last statement. This is manifest by the fact that for ESA, the Earth observation program is by far the most funded or largest funded program of the European Space Agency. We currently constitute 1/3 of the budget of the European Space Agency in order to prepare and to reassure the users on the long-term commitment on the infrastructure and the data that is coming from what you're seeing in that slide. So thank you again for having me and for getting my perspective on this trust element. Let me also say that from our perspective, of course, industry, the global industry is the key element and the key partner in that trust building exercise as well. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Nicholas. I would remind folks who've joined us online that there is a Slido link to post questions should you have any for any of the speakers that we had today. I'd actually, we were going to go to the front of the room, yes? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask Kevin, who's here with us today, to come to the front of the room, and we will you and me. Oh, the same. Yeah. There's no middle. So while we, oh, that's great. There you go. So while we wait for questions to come in from our online audience, I'd like to open the floor to anyone in the room, members of the GGSC, to start the discussion around these 3 speakers today. So I invite those of you in the committee. Yes, Kirsten.
So I have a question, and maybe this, I mean, you all 3 are talking about trust and the geospatial data. And Kevin, you know, you started it with these other industries and other areas. And, you know, I think that for me, I'm thinking about geospatial data as very broad in a way. And I'm wondering if, you talk about this because there's so many domains that use geospatial data. We were talking last week about, the transportation industry, there's, everybody uses this geospatial data. And I think it's getting more complicated because it's going beyond just geospatial, which is why we're calling this geodigital. Can you maybe talk about how you even have examples? Last, week we talked about, in the maritime, world, the Titanic sinking was one of the, impetuses for having to have regulations. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some specifics? Because I think that maybe people, the reason it's difficult is it's so broad. What some approaches might you have?
Well, let me start by highlighting what you've said, which is that, yes, it becomes more complex because geospatial information is used in so many different sectors. So in my world, so we use the construction industry, or I talked about the construction infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure in my talk. Each of those have their own set of laws and requirements that if you're feeding geospatial information into that, you need to be mindful of. You need to understand what your user is. If you're not in the construction industry, if you're not in the mobility industry, you need to understand what laws that they're dealing with, and particularly what laws their lawyers care about. If you're working in big organizations, the same for government agencies, right? They have their own authorities, they have their own responsibilities. So that's one that doesn't necessarily address your question, but it does. It's an example of an additional complexity that you need to think about. In the maritime world, one of the unique aspects of maritime, and the conversation that Kristen was referring to last week was regarding mobility data and how we look at it in the transportation sector, and maybe looking at charts, electronic charts, and how those compared to hydrographic charts or aeronautical charts. And the point I was trying to make, and I think this is what you're getting to, Kristen, is a lot of this work right now is by analogy. So you'd be looking at, if you have a transportation charts, if you will, how's the charts treated under hydrographic law, maritime law, aeronautical law? What cases do you look at? What regulations do you look at? How do governments deal with issues around liability? How do governments deal with issues around contracting? So I think there's a lot of sort of right now, because geospatial information does touch on so many areas, there is a lot of novelty as analogy that you need to do. These aren't novel issues, right? There are lawyers who understand all these things, but it's applying them to this particular domain, this particular type of data, these particular types of application that gets to be the real issue. And privacy, I think, is a perfect example of that. Understanding all the different ways that location information is collected and how it can be used to potentially identify someone I don't think anyone has a good handle on right now. And I think someone should. I think this sector could be part of it, because you don't want to have it regulated. And then what often happens is then you have a lawyer has this vague law, has this vague regulation, and you're asked to share data, and they say, I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to collect this data. I don't want to be liable for it. And then someone gets mad because they've got this product they want to do or this project that they want to do, and they blame lawyers. But it's human nature, right? It's what you do. If you don't understand the technology, if you don't understand the application, you don't understand how it's going to be used, you're going to say no more often than you say yes, particularly if you're brought in at the very end and you're given 24 hours to sort of come up with something. Does that help?
Christine and Nicholas, if there's anything you want to add, feel free to come off mute at any point and add to the comments. And then moderating both online and in person is always an interesting, but Christine.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, no answers really to that question. To provide a bit of a perspective in terms of what's happening with member states and authoritative data. Of course, we have this changing context where there are some domains that are tightly regulated. You've got charts, land administration boundaries, et cetera, that are typically the domain of governments. And but other data has for many years traditionally been provided by governments. But now with many data providers, governments are looking at, well, what is their role? What should they build? What should they be doing? What data should they be producing? If they're not producing it, but they need it, or they know the public needs it, then how do they create an environment that makes sure that data is available, affordable, it still respects privacy? So then you start to be looking at, again, like to Kevin's points about to what extent does IP, privacy legislation, et cetera, facilitate that and, strike the balance of protections and availability of data. And within the government, that is also sometimes challenging to impact because of those things are not developed by my organization. I work for a geospatial organization. They're developed somewhere else. So then I have to be thinking differently about how I engage or who I engage with to be even a part of these conversations. And now the same thing again, now there's AI. And so we're trying to insert ourselves into those conversations, but it's taking us out of a lot of, I'd say, our comfort zone of what we're used to being able to control or deal with.
Maybe just a few words from my perspective. Again, more the Earth observation, general data provision angle. And of course, the question of liability when it comes to actual services based on this data is something that is very concrete for us as well. But we try to treat it as something in which we also try to foster industrial competitiveness. We see solutions to the liability challenge as part of the industrial innovation process, if I may say so. And we see differences. We see some differences in the way that companies, that institutions as well, are tackling these issues. And we see more bolder approaches, even on the legal perspective on liabilities. And we see a landscape developing on these questions. So I think it's not only a restricting component from our perspective. We find these challenges of liability, of assurances that have legal implications, something quite stimulating for some of the new companies, for example, that we see based on Earth observation data. So I can even relate positively to some of these, I think, inherently a bit restrictive components that are being described.
Thank you. We actually have another question in the room. Chen, if you'd love.
And just a second, if we can remind people in the room to please introduce yourselves before you ask your question. Thank you.
Great.
Hi, Kevin. This is Chen from UT Austin. I'm very interested in the trust problem in geospatial data, and we talk about the trust in authoritative geospatial data. Can I also talk about the trust issue related to generated geospatial data, such as a lot of map companies, they are generating synthetic trajectories because of the privacy issue. And now we also have the data generated synthetic satellite images used for downstream tasks. So for example, now we may facing the challenge of whether we can utilize this generative geospatial data on downstream applications. On the other side is, can we utilize this generative data for further training the AI models? Yeah.
Can you repeat the question? The question at the end? I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear the end.
Yes. So basically, the core question is, can you provide us some like your suggestions or opinions about the trustworthiness on the generated geospatial data? How it can be applied on downstream tasks? Can we trust them? And how we can apply it to further train the foundation models, such as the IBM, NASA's recent geospatial foundation model. Yeah.
So one of the, I think this will address your question, Kevin Pomfret. One, I think the unique aspects of the geospatial community, in my opinion anyways, is metadata and the importance of value of metadata. And I expect, I'm not an AI expert by any means, but I expect metadata is going to be an integral part of developing training models around geo AI models. And I know there are issues around the quality of metadata and how complete they are, but putting those aside, but I do think that's a technical solution that has to be resolved, right? If you want to get into trust. So that's one aspect. I don't know, and I would be surprised. I don't usually see metadata addressed in contracts or agreements between parties, right? So you represent that the metadata is accurate or complete, or it's been updated. That would be one way I would think you would deal with some of the trust issues. But I'm not even sure what metadata is from a legal context. Is it what's being licensed, Or is it documentation? How do you even deal with it? And that goes to the representations and warranties and things associated with agreements. So I think it would be helpful to get a framework around that and understanding how to deal with it if you're going to start, particularly if you start building synthetic data and you start building it into models where it goes into this black box. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. One specific observation for the recent, I think for the recent Nature paper is the observe situation called model collapse, which means, okay, you have a lot of data and train AI foundation models, and then they use the generative AI to generate some data, and then use the generative data to retrain the model. And then they find out the distribution of the model start to clapping, because the model, when you're using the collected data, the model have some bias, and this bias was inherited by the foundation models. And if the generated data also inherit this bias and keep training that, and bias become higher and higher, and the whole model seems like the diversity they keep declining, and this become a huge issue in the current foundation model. But I think that's also a huge issue in geospatial context.
So I didn't talk about this in my talk, but one of the challenges I see with AI and geo AI is that I was practicing law when the internet first became a thing, right? And there was this concerted effort by lawmakers and regulators to not regulate, to not have the heavy hand of regulation, to let it develop. And partly it was because they didn't understand it and they understood that. But partly it was because we were at a different age and it was this sense that we were going to sort of let it go and see what happens and things. We're at a different time with respect to AI. And there's this balance between countries wanting to promote AI and become leaders in it, but also being concerned of the regulatory aspect, of the risks associated with it. And in a lot of parts of the world, and the U.S. has gone back and forth, and there's some tension between at the federal level, whether there's going to be as part of this bill that's being debated in Congress for the budget, there's some prohibition in there that would prevent states from regulating AI for 10 years, which, I mean, putting aside the politics would mean that it would essentially there'd be very little regulation regarding, except for some data protection laws and maybe some liability issues. But assuming without that, states are very much looking to regulate AI without fully understanding it, right? And without understanding how it works or what it's going to do. And so you have this tension where you're going to sort of, you could have very bad laws just because we don't know where the technology is going. But to address your specific point, the laws that are developing, if you look at the EU AI Act and some of the US laws that have developed, there is this sense that we need to be transparent about what the training data was and how it was developed, and it has to be tested continuously to make sure that there isn't the bias that you talk about or the discrimination or the failure. So they're trying to figure out how to deal with that, but it's really, really hard to do. I will say that apparently Japan just passed an AI Act just the other day that apparently goes in a different direction, and I haven't had a chance to look at that. But those are really important issues that there needs to be a legal component to, in my opinion.
Thank you.
I think this is a really interesting question because we've been talking about bias related to other issues, gender, race, other in different contexts. And I think in the Geospatial Sciences Committee, there's a little more of a sense that sort of remotely sensed data or geospatial data is not inherently open to bias, right? Because it's sort of its imagery, right? It's truth. It's what you see. It's not sort of some of these, right? Which we can all sort of debate that, right? But I think you bring up an excellent point that there actually are conversations about AI and bias, right? And like how AIs create bias, especially as you say in sort of training data, then using that and retraining on created data that have happened in other fields that I think it's time for sort of the geospatial community to really engage in and talk about in a different way, but definitely start talking about it actively to make sure that the trust we have in the data we've created is founded, right, in the science. So thank you for bringing that point up. Nicholas, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick comment on this topic. it's clear also from our perspective that artificial intelligence constitutes the main challenge in all of these respects on liability and trust. But let's not forget that there's a different dimension that will continuously impact that discussion as well, which is the simple diversity, complexity, and sheer volume of data, which is asking for new ways of data management. And all the new ways of managing geospatial data, Earth observation data, has in itself implications on the trustworthiness and the liability that goes with the data as well. Data compression technologies, streaming technologies, all of these things are influencing a little bit these aspects. Clearly AI, the key topic, but let's not forget there are other issues related to the evolution of the overall ecosystem.
Yes, that's a great point. I'm going to go to one of the questions online, and then I'll come back to you, Andrew, in the room. So we have a question from Daryl Dudley. He's from DOT, Bureau of Transportation Statistics. And his question is, the UN GGIM has a policy and legal frameworks working group. Are there similar efforts at the national level around the world, or perhaps other models that we might emulate in this regard? If not, what can we do to advance this conversation and make meaningful progress? I don't know if I can throw that to you, Christine. Yes, thank you.
Fair enough. He mentioned the UNGJM. Thank you for asking that question, because that's actually a question I would love to put out to the group. To what extent do these exist? I mean, our observation, and Kevin has also mentioned this in the past, is that we are currently lacking that legal capacity in the geospatial community, and such that we're looking at the need for a rallying statement to get legal and AI and geospatial communities connected. So I would say I'm not aware of any specific efforts. Various countries have some form of sort of national bodies or councils that may or may not discuss it. But if anyone does know of examples such as this, I would be very pleased to hear about them. And of course, we would love to promote this as a best practice.
Yeah, just following up on what Christine says, I don't know of any countries that have a policy group that that was mentioned in the question. There are some countries, so the UNGGIM has put together something called the 9 strategic pathways. And I think Christine had a chart of that, and legal and policy is the second one, strategic pathway 2. And a lot of the work that is done within the group that Christine co-chairs sort of flows from that and sort of ties to that. There are some countries, and Saudi Arabia is an example, that are really following the UNGGIM pathways very closely and is focused on strategic pathway 2. Other countries are looking at it as well. I know. I don't think they have the full extent, to Christine's point, of a bunch of lawyers that are getting together and talking about these issues and doing things about it. But I think they're trying to do that. As I mentioned, the U.S., I think, is looking to adapt some of the strategic pathway 2 as well, looking to adopt the IGIF, of which strategic pathway 2 is an effort. As I mentioned yesterday in my talk, or last week, and I think I talked to Daryl about it, I think a legal working group for the FGDC would be fantastic. I think someone within these organizations that is coming together and talking about some issues would really help the FGDC and some of the work that's being done. But I don't know where that stands. I know it's really hard to implement.
Thank you. Andrew, if you would like to turn on your mic and ask your question, I invite you.
Yes, thank you. Andrew Turner from Esri. So my question is actually to all 3 panelists, but probably with different perspectives. So in terms of thinking about the legal aspects of use rights and liability, actually, Kevin, you said metadata, right? Metadata is a really important aspect where data have it to describe how it was gathered, how it can be used. It often has a textual description of the liability, the trust, the maintainability. Nicholas talked about also the implicit aspect of the maintenance of data over time. However, Kevin, you also mentioned that a lot of the legal, while it's a code, it's usually, I'll use the word verbose. I mean, it's an opinion aspect. It ends up being unique each time. Someone as an engineer and people using this data, what seems to be lacking, or I'm curious if anyone knows anything about the development of standards and machine readable interoperable standards around the legal aspects of data, so that especially with AI, but even machines as they are now, could search, find, and evaluate and even test how the data can be used as indicated by the data provider. Are there any standards or anything that's evolved? I know this was Creative Commons was a really big innovation early in the 2000s. I think there was work around that for data in the 2010s, but I'm not aware anything's occurred. So either Kevin, if you know from a legal aspect, or colleagues Christine or Nicholas from the implementation side, if any of those are established or emerging.
Well, I'll start. I don't think it's exactly the same, but I think it has some of the same attributes as the efforts to do digital rights management around geospatial information. I know the OGC was trying to do that. I think GEO, Group on Earth Observation, was looking into that, their working group. I don't think it got very far. I think it's really, really complicated. And part of it, frankly, is because, in my opinion, the ownership rights, copyright issues associated with data and how you deal with that, because it's different than software in terms of your ability to protect it from a copyright standpoint. So that's a challenge. I also think that one of the challenges is, compared to software on some of these things, is that data is meant to be shared, right? So maps are meant to be shared. And so the legal issues when data is shared or when maps are shared are much more complex than when you're doing something internally. And I think that may be one of the challenges. So the short answer is, other than what OGC and some of those groups are trying to do, I haven't seen anything in 10 plus years. But it's a worthy effort. It would be a big test, though, in my opinion.
Shall I say a few words?
Please do.
Yeah, we have a bit of a different context, as the question was already mentioning. I mean, with a free and open data policy, the challenge looks a little bit more practical in terms of how to measure the ease and the understanding of the implications of the liability, trust implications of the users. And the approach that we are taking is that the ultimate measure of level of comfort is in the data access. So we have a strong focus on the data access environment, on all the quantitative and qualitative measures that we can take on the data access side, on user behavior, to try to interpret what I think is also the legal, the commercial, all the contextual information that can be derived from all these complexities. But again, it's a very specific Earth observation, free and open data policy driven perspective. And I think in that context, it's a bit easier than in specific commercial data environments, for example. But for us, the data access environment itself is equipped, and we try to equip it even more with even more sophistication to really understand the perspective and the concerns on all these issues that the user brings to the data, basically.
I did want to, this is Kevin Pomfret, I did want to add a legal spin to the conversation around free and open. Open data is still subject to a license unless it's put in the public domain. And there are a number of different open data licenses that are out there now. And some of them are pretty complex. Some of them are very simple. Some of them align, some of them don't. And from a legal standpoint, it can be really challenging to try to figure out what you can and can't do even under an open data license. And so I think that still goes to the point that you're referring to, is that, Andrew, that yeah, some of these issues, it would be good if you could build it into the metadata or figure out a way from a machine learning standpoint, because I know a lot of organizations that struggle trying to combine data sets from different open licenses. And to the point that was asked earlier about federated, in my sense, and you all know better than me, but products and services now are combining data sets from a variety of sources: government, industry, the crowd, social media, all subject to different license agreements, all subject to different requirements. So it's going to be really hard. Again, going to be harder and harder to figure out what you can and can't do.
I do have another question from online. Thank you, Andrew. Mike Tischler, who's with USGS, we are now operating in an environment where generated data is approaching the look and feel of geospatial data created from real observations. Beyond just metadata, do you think authoritative providers may have to consider a certification process or something similar to ensure their authenticity?
Just quickly, from a European Space Agency perspective, we are running industrial services on data authenticity. If a company needs a certification on the authenticity of Copernicus data, for example, this is provided as an industrial service that we are fostering and that we are defining, that we are supporting.
I'm curious if there are organizations in the United States that have anything similar. I am not aware in this space. So if anybody. Oh, there, Christine, yes, you do have your hand. I'm sorry, there was some weird technical issue. Please go ahead.
That's fine. I actually would just want to add to that question and ask who should be responsible for the certification process, because it could be voluntary sort of industry-led initiative, or you may wish to have governments, or in the ESA context, they are facilitating that, but it's just a consideration about where you would see that located and who would be responsible for that.
Marguerite, please.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, related to this, I just wanted to point out the efforts of professional societies might think about. The society I'm involved with is ASPRS, American Society of Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing. And I mean, traditionally they had map accuracy standards that USGS certainly follows for all their mapping, topographic mapping. And but they recently, 2024, they issued the second edition of version 2 of positional accuracy standards for digital geospatial data. And so there's a committee within ASPRS. They worked really hard to put these standards together. They also had formal public review for a period of time. And then they incorporated those comments. And also a lot of the people on the committee are from industry. So Dr. Qassam Abdullah, he's vice president and chief scientist of Woolpert, for example. He led this committee. And just to for everyone to kind of be aware of it, they have general guidelines, best practices, field surveying or ground control, checkpoints, and then they added 4 more: mapping with photogrammetry, mapping with LiDAR, mapping with the UAS, uncrewed aerial systems, and then also mapping with oblique imagery. So just to be aware of those, that it may help, I think, for authoritative data or to vet your data or certify it, to know that these standards are out there and just kind of check them out, I think.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting conversation in other fields, right? And we've enlisted both funding agencies and sort of journals, right? The peer-reviewed literature to ensure that a set of standards have been met before research can be published, right? And so it's an more indirect way of sort of ensuring that there's some sort of a standard to either the data you use or you've collected. But I also wonder if there's a role in sort of more formal institutions and sort of requiring a certain level of data certification before things are published or go public. And that's one aspect of the work that's being done. There's a tremendous amount of work in private industry that's much more hard, much more difficult. But a lot of work starts, right, with funding from either federal or international agencies or other who could work those standards into the ways in which they require that work to be funded. So that's all, that's another thought that I had. I don't know if you wanted to. Yeah, Heinrich.
Yeah, I have a simple question. Actually, maybe mostly for Kevin, but in general, I mean, you would think, right, this notion, right here, we're talking about information. Information is being used in different industries, which are regulated, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, we talked a little bit about sort of fake information and validation of that. I mean, you would think that in the media industry, right, they have figured this out a long time ago, right? So what is there anything we can learn from other sectors and industries as it relates to this problem? Because fundamentally, I don't think it is that right. It is new that you use information in different ways under different license terms, et cetera, and we want to create new information, et cetera. Yeah, that's my.
I thought you said you were going to ask a simple question. Is your question regarding the licensing issue and why how other industries have dealt with it, or because you mentioned disinformation or wrong?
A little clearer. What is unique about the geospatial aspect, right? Because if I think about it, okay, there's geospatial information. There are license issues, right? I want to combine it and I have different terms of conditions. That's fundamentally not really new, right? I have this in other areas.
There are very few areas that combine as many different data sets for as many different applications that is powerful as geospatial, right? That's why there are so many geospatial organizations. There are so many geospatial communities. I mean, the power of this technology, the power of location, just from a privacy standpoint, the issues associated with being able to identify someone, to take location information and aggregate it with, you can tie so many other pieces to it. How many pieces does it take before you can identify someone with a high degree of certainty? And how much of that data is open data? And who's responsible if it's used improperly, right? Just that fundamental question is something that no one has their arms around right now. Or they're just that, like, that's some, like, some people will tell you that you can't anonymize data, because if you can always find a way to aggregate it with other information. Most of it is location, like the big part of it is location information. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the versatility of data. I tell people all the time, health information, financial information is much more sensitive, but location information is much more versatile. It can be used for so many different areas. So for instance, HIPAA, again, getting into a privacy issue, but HIPAA around health data and the privacy issues associated with that. Now we're collecting location information that has a health component to it. How do you treat that? Is that health information? Is that HIPAA protected, or do you need another regime to do it? So that's another aspect. The national security issues associated with this. I mean, I believe, I mentioned in my bio, I've helped U.S. satellite Earth observation companies get licenses to collect satellite data for U.S. companies that is the same as other companies outside the United States. They have to do more to comply with that license than TikTok needs to do to collect location information on millions of Americans, if not more, every day. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense to me fundamentally, right? Because of the value of location information and how it can be used. So I mean, I can talk days about this. We can go out and have drinks, but I do think location information, geospatial information is fundamentally different. So Netflix, if you go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, maybe worthwhile thinking about it, but I would think, right, if you take different data sets, you abstract it a little bit from the geospatial world, and you take your buying history and your history, what you listen to, right, as music, you get closer and closer and closer into other regimes where there are other regulations. And so I would like to think that there might be something which we can learn from.
Those from a privacy standpoint, yes. There's GDPR in Europe, there's the CCPA in California. Virginia has a Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act, but they struggle with how to deal with location information. So because of the way, in Texas, there was a lawsuit brought against certain companies, and I forget who they are. I don't know the validity of the lawsuit, but they were collecting information through apps, on location information on apps. It was being sold, I believe, to insurance companies to do automobile insurance, right? The problem is they don't know if that person was driving or in an Uber, right? So because of the way location information is collected, it's a different animal. I talked to someone, I won't go into the, but I agree that there are frameworks you can start with, but my career, frankly, is based on that. Yeah, you need to look at the location aspect and deal with those issues because they are much more complex. National security, liability, privacy, and then intellectual property rights and licensing, because that's where the liability comes through if you make a mistake.
Nicholas, you have your hand raised. I'll throw it to you.
I try a very concrete answer, but with a different angle again. From an Earth observation perspective, the whole question of how Earth observation data can be relevant for new regulatory and policy domains. And that's a constant thought that we are pursuing, and that is driving a lot of our programmatic planning. And here we are very clear, because that's also what industry tells us. They start to engage with Earth observation data when they get the feeling that we are ready to embark on all the commitments that are necessary to do the things that they have done in order to get commercially into the business of financial regulation. I think that's the big domain that we see in Europe as a key regulatory domain in which even commercial companies have a big stake. And the other is IT regulation. I think the IT sector is so vibrant, so much pioneering a lot of the questions on which we are embarking to become relevant as an Earth observation provider, that I would name these two regulatory and policy domains as the key references that I hear from the industries that are already successfully commercially engaged to provide solutions to users in these domains. So for us, IT regulation, IT policies, and financial regulations are kind of guiding lights for a lot of these implementations.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments from folks online to answer some of the questions that have been tossed around. Heather Brown says that NOAA, NESDIS, and CEI does certify its data. So there's another organization that definitely certifies information. And then Karen Wood or Rami Wood, it's both on the thing. I think U.S. Arctic Observing Network might be a collaborator. I'm assuming that is referring to the policy and legal framework working groups as well. So just wanted to provide those, since our listeners online provided those comments. I would like to also invite Raul, who is one of our panelists who joins us online. Raul, you had your hand up, and I wanted to make sure if you had a question, you had the space to do so. So if so, you can come on camera, come off mute, and join us.
I don't have a question. I was actually going to add a comment to the question that was asked earlier about certifying the data.
Oh, that's great. Please go.
Yeah, I think it's been mentioned about NOAA. I think there are ways to digitally sign your data so that, if there is a way, if people have generated fake data, you can go verify whether it's authentic or not. I think the challenges, and Nick can answer this too, is the cost associated with it for us dealing with Earth observations. We're talking about millions and millions and petabytes of files. So trying to put signatures and then putting an infrastructure to allow people to come and verify, it's a cost that, that's one of the reasons most of us have not done it, is the enormous cost associated with it.
Fully confirm what Raul is saying. This is a big cost factor for us, but I can tell you just in terms of general awareness and institutional awareness, in particular in the Copernicus context, this kind of additional cost endeavor and additional service that we are providing is key, is paying off, and it's we have introduced data authenticators in the Copernicus data a long time ago. So that's part of the general policy, and it's paying off that we have done this. But it's very costly. I can just assure you that everything that Raul was saying is very true from our perspective.
Thank you. I have one other comment from Joe Offmuth online. Just a statement that there is a related organization, ISPRS, which is the international version of ASPRS. They hold a conference every February in Denver, Colorado. So just adding that in. I have one online question, and then I'll come to you, Kristen. From Michael Flower. Earth systems scientists use geospatial data, basically from ocean temperature sensors, as an example, to create digital world representations of planetary change. Does the geospatial community look to legal questions associated with scientific findings that enter into decision making, for example, public policy or economics? I can see you're nodding your head, Nicholas. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm nodding because it's probably one of the most recurrent questions and considerations that we have right now. We are fully entering the domain of what we call digital twin Earth applications. So the question that we are discussing from our perspective is not so much about the validity and the trust of what the data represents in currently, or what it has represented in the past, but how everything that we're discussing here relates to predictions. Predictive Earth observation is the big new game, and it's covering the whole range from agricultural prediction to extreme weather event predictions, and it's something that is triggering a host of completely new questions. It's one thing to verify the accuracy and the precision of the data that you're providing, and to assure continuity on programs and the things that I mentioned earlier, and then to enter the whole domain of what we call the predictive Earth observation domain. And that's what is really looked for, and these are our most vibrant programs, I would say, where we are linking the processing power and data and AI and physical and other models in order to get to these predictive models. And honestly, for many of these aspects, we don't have a good solution on the questions of liability, for example.
Yeah, please.
I think digital twins are a good example of what I was referring to before in terms of lack of a construct to compare it to, because digital twins is going to require so many different data sets from so many different organizations being used in near real time for critical decision makings both now and in the future. And I don't know of any, anything in the media or any other construct where that is taking place at the level that we're talking about in terms of having a representation of a city or a building or a town, and the liability issues associated with getting it wrong, particularly when you're changing from a model, as Christine mentioned, where a lot of this was government data, to the commercial sector providing it and making sure they're protected, and how liability is allocated and who's indemnified and all of those things. I hate to say it, but lawyers are going to get involved, and they're going to worry about those things. So that's another reason why I think it's really hard for me to think of an example where you can go to and say, if we do this for the geospatial sector, we can develop, because again, it goes to the power and the versatility of the data.
Yeah. You would introduce yourself.
If I just made a foot, just as a footnote on what is just said, because it's really relevant. I think a domain where we are learning a lot is what we call emergency and disaster management, because there we don't have much time to think about legal implications. In some cases, we'll just have to go out with information that may be relevant, may be misleading, and there's a strong risk involved sometimes, but it's in many cases necessary to take these risks in order to mitigate immediate danger to people and to.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Emiliano.
Yes, hi, my name is Emiliano Duque. I come from the World Bank. I'm retired, and but I had to deal with one of these forecasting problems when the Ukraine war invasion happened, and we declared an emergency in food. We said there was going to be a food shortage. That was based not on a digital twin, but with a model based on the 2008 crisis. It took us 4 months to realize that there was no food crisis at all. The UN even created a special shipment zone, whereas by using the AIS information from the ships on board, which was only managed by Standards and Poor's in a private subscription of $150,000, which nobody had, okay, except the 4 big companies, which they realized, the price of wind went up 70% in 4 months. The cost was $30 billion to the countries. So just for not disclosing information, I mean, the question is, was that AIS information was public? It was only one private company which cleaned it, and all they needed to do is add what in every ship was that it was grain. And the actual amount of grain being shipped across the world went down only 1.6%, which was, a margin of error. So you say data is meant to be shared. You are worried about the trust of the data you put out there. I'm worried about the trust of the data that you don't put out there. The data that is being collected that could have immediately said there is no shortage of wheat. There is no shortage. People in the business, they knew it, and that's why they took, short business, and they had the best quarter in their history. Cargill and ADM and all these guys, why, the country's clients of the World Bank paid an extra $30 billion in wheat for not having the proper data which is available. So that's our concern. This data is to be shared. Right now, who has it? And how do we make it better or worse? It was, the only data available was the USDA forecast that comes every month. So, however that our data was poor, it was better than that one. That's the concern we have.
So my opinion, that goes to Christine's point about trying to figure out how do you balance, if governments collect that data or industry collects that data, and what their responsibilities are and who pays for it and how much you pay for it. I mean, I believe personally there is a misappreciation of data as an asset within any organization. As a lawyer, my role is to enhance its value and protect against its risk. But in other organizations, I think it's how do you look about it. So for instance, the US government in the Earth observation space will want to license data by one government agency to license it and pay for it from one budget, but to share it across government, to share it with allies, and to share it with researchers and academic institutes. That hurts the marketplace for commercial providers that want to be able to sell to those other places too. And that, in my opinion, doesn't fully account for the cost it takes to build a satellite and to operate a satellite in an environment where the US government has historically said we want a vibrant commercial marketplace. So it's a fundamental understanding of data, and I don't mean to pick on Esri, but it doesn't make the government, there's not a requirement that Esri share its software across government agencies, right? But for some reason, data is another intangible asset that's treated differently. And it's those sort of things that I think governments need to deal with, the work that Christine's doing, budget folks need to deal with, because I agree, in this environment, data is becoming critical, but I still think we look at it in a way that I don't think is really accurate anymore from a legal standpoint, financial standpoint, and operational standpoint.
I think we are just about at time. So I want to thank all of our panelists again, Kevin, Christine, and Nicholas. It was a great discussion, I think, really interesting topics. We'll take about a 10-minute break now before we move on to our next session on evolving geospatial data, the role of AI. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll be back in about 10 minutes.
Thank you.
those encourages companies to please share that you're using it, and that's what we love that resource. Right.
Okay, welcome back. In the next session, we will hear from 3 speakers on the role of AI in evolving geospatial data. So I would like to investigate, has AI changed what data we need? Has AI changed how we consume data? Has AI changed how we generate data? What is the impact of AI generate synthetic data, and how does it change trust? We already started on that. Each speaker is going to speak for 10 minutes. After all the speakers have presented, we'll have 25 minutes for questions, so keep your questions. First from the committee and then from the webinar audience. You can post them in the chat. And then, of course, we can also have a broader discussion. Our first speaker is Rahul Ramachandran. Rahul is a thought leader. He is a senior research scientist at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he also serves as a senior data science strategist for the Science Research and Project Division. His expertise spans data science, informatics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, with a focus on developing innovative methods to manage and analyze very large geospatial data sets. Rahul, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thanks. Let me see if I can share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I will actually talk a little bit about the role of AI focused on earth science, from a science research and applications perspective. That's kind of my area of focus. I'll talk about 2 things that we are working on, and I think I'll address some of the questions that were raised by Hendrik at the beginning. The first one is using AI as a tool to extract new knowledge from the large amounts of geospatial data sets that we have, and that's the focus on foundation models. And the second aspect is AI as a collaborator. I think this is where we are heading towards, where AI is basically fundamentally a collaborator. It's no longer a tool. And that's basically this work on accelerated knowledge discovery that we are doing. So just for context, why we are looking at AI in a very systematic enterprise-based approach, NASA Science Mission Directorate, we have a huge volume of data archive that we collect from different assets on different platforms. So large volumes of these and wide variety of these data sets are actually assets, earth science assets. So we are reaching scales that we cannot, manage these data sets the way we've been doing with our traditional approaches. And we cannot extract insights from these data sets and effectively utilize these high-value data sets using our traditional approach techniques. So we really need to look at AI at enterprise level so that we can utilize this high-value data archive in a way, in a more effective manner. So one strategy that we came up with was looking at this notion of 5+1 strategy that we try to build AI foundation models for high-value data sets across each Science Mission Directorate. And then one language model-based approach that is cross-cutting, that looks at workflows that could impact across the different science divisions. So the first one, as I mentioned, I'll focus on the AI foundation models, where AI is fundamentally you're looking at as a tool to extract insights from the data. So most of you may already know this, but the idea behind the foundation model is that you can take large amounts of data that's in your archive, in high-value data sets in our archive. You can do something called pre-training where the model learns patterns in the data without needing any kind of labeled data, right? That's the whole notion of self-supervised learning. So that's it's a pretty involved process. To do it right requires a lot of effort. I'll talk a little bit more about it. But once you have built this foundation model, the model is then useful for many, many different users. So it can support different individual researchers for different applications. And they can use it in many different ways, whether it's a zero-shot learning or they do fine-tuning. So they can then customize that base model and use it for many downstream applications. So as I mentioned, building these models is a non-trivial thing. This is trying to build a useful model that will actually help the science community and the applications community. So this is not just trying to build a model to write a paper. This requires expertise, diverse set of expertise. You need science expertise to define the science use cases. You need AI researchers who can basically utilize the latest approaches. You need data engineers who can clean the data. You need ML engineers to help, create use cases that the model can be utilized. You need infrastructure engineers who can help you scale as you build larger and larger models. You have to use larger and larger computing facilities. And to close the loop, because these models are so new and innovative, that you really need AI trainers to train the scientific and research community to utilize these models for their science applications. So to do this correctly actually requires a team. Our approach to this has been that we realize that no single team or organization can do this effectively. So we basically do it as an open collaboration. It is basically grounded in principles of open science that everyone's willing who's willing to contribute something can participate. And the entire work is done in an open, transparent manner with input so that people can understand all the assumptions that went into the design, development of the model, what data sets were used, how it was tested. So that has been the approach for us to build these models out. So where we start, it's fundamentally driven by science use cases. We are not trying to build a model for the sake of building a model. All these models have inherent, they're built with inherent assumptions. It's very hard, at least right now, to build a model that can span spatial resolutions that go from, meters to thousands of kilometers, or spatial scales in seconds to, decades. So you have to have science use cases that put bounding box on what you're trying to build, what data sets you need to address the science use cases. So these are very much have to be driven by, high value use cases that we get from the science and application community. So these are the two examples. One on the left is for weather and climate effort. The other one for heliophysics, where we had different use cases. And based on those use cases, we defined what we want to tackle in our design and what we don't want to tackle within our design. Some of the work that came out of this effort, Prithvi is fairly well-known effort. We built the first version, which is a proof of concept use case. The first version, it was a limited model, only used data over US for a year's worth of HLS data. The selection of HLS was very intentional. It is the second most popular data set in our archive. The second version of this model that was released in December of last year was basically the improvements were made based on the feedback we got from the user community who were using the data. Things, obviously the spatial region was expanded to the entire globe. The entire archive was utilized. We modified the sampling scheme that was used to train the data based on the feedback we got. We added more contextual information based on the metadata, like the time of the day, the location information. All those were added. And again, this was done collaboratively. We had partners, we had IBM Research who helped us out. We have worked with Unix Supercomputing for compute. And we had many different universities who were providing us science use cases to test this out. The other model that we have released in September last year was weather and climate foundation model. This was done with IBM, Oak Ridge, and other universities. The idea here is not to build a forecasting model. It was to build a foundation model where which could be used in any application that requires atmospheric state information. So you could utilize it for multiple different applications and combine atmospheric information into your use cases here. It's been about a year and a half since we released this suite of Prithvi models, and we were really surprised by the success of the adoption of these models downstream. We've seen about 200 plus downloads of the foundation model, as well as some of the fine-tuned models that we have built. And they've been used for a wide variety of applications. There has been industry adoption. There've been tooling development around it. So it shows the value of these models, which that make our geospatial data much more accessible and usable to a wider user community. I think this was mentioned, earlier. Where remote sensing, especially if you're doing retrievals on remote sensing, it's fundamentally an under constraint problem, and the way to tackle it is to use observations from multiple modalities. So the future is looking at combining multiple modalities to build models that can basically address wide varieties of problems. This is an example of a model that was funded by ESA. This is led by IBM Research with ETH Zurich. We are helping them out to test the model to see how well it's doing in terms of the multimodality part of it. Is it really learning information on the SAR and the optical sensor information here? So that's what we're doing talking about AI and the data set and the trust. I think one thing for us is very important. We want to build these models with the same rigor as we produce our scientific data sets, right? So we want to understand what the models are learning in terms of explainability and what it's not learning. We need to know where they fail, what it's good at doing and what's not good at doing. This is an example of us exploring the weather and foundation model, weather and climate foundation model, using basic equations. So you can actually explain the state of the atmosphere using 6 governing equations. We went and tested the model using these 6 governing equations to see what the limits of these foundation model are, where it fails and where it doesn't fail. So that explainability part of it is very important for us in terms of transparency of these AI models and their adoption downstream. This is something I put together for students in terms of how do you assess AI foundation model for Earth observations. A traditional way of looking at a foundation model is looking at benchmarks. It's a very engineer's way of looking at it, how well a model A is doing versus on a benchmark against versus model B. But I think from a science perspective, it's very important to understand the model itself and use the benchmark as a validation of your assessment of the design of the model. So things you have to look at is, what was the data it was pre-trained in? How was the data, where did they get the data? Was it a, authoritative source? How was it pre-processed? Was the data modified in some ways before it was fed into the model? How was it modified? How was it structured? Then you can look at the architecture and say, okay, what did the architecture add so that it is novel, that it learns new? Then you look at the evaluation part of it. You do look at the benchmarks that were used to test the data out. Is it, representative of the use case that you are trying to test, utilize your model, and is it only limited to a few sets of use cases? So these are the things that we want as these models become more and more common tools in people's toolkit. We want them to think through before they select a model and utilize it for their downstream applications. Okay, I'm switching gears. So I talked about AI as a tool. This is looking at AI as a collaborator. And this is, one of the projects that we are working on, the notion of accelerated knowledge discovery. I think what we are seeing, right now is this big shift because of this whole AI-based agent systems, right? Where you're transitioning from looking at AI just as static tools, but as, what we call thinking partners who can help you in the entire research workflow, starting all the way from literature review, doing hypothesis generation, doing experimental design, data analysis, all the way to manuscript writing. So AI is integrated in the entire part of your research workflow. I think it sounds big and grand. I think it is actually happening now, and it can impact the area, the things that are what we call closed loop scientific workflows. So where there are very well-defined boundaries. We have a well-defined scientific scope, within which you can operate. There's a well-defined set of tools and services that can be utilized, and you can have these closed loop, automations done where the AI can go refine the hypothesis, execute experiments, and get your output back. And what is needed is human in the loop to make sure that there's guardrails to ensure there is scientific rigor and they're looking at ethical compliance without sacrificing speed. So this is an example of what the future would look like in terms of the tooling. You would give a problem statement to the agentic system like this. I think this is looking at oil palm classification using machine learning, and that objective would be spawned off to different agents, which will start doing literature survey, literature review, finding gaps in existing research, and then formulating the experiments that could be done to address that gap. I think if we are moving towards the system, trust needs to be foundational. We are asking the AI to be a collaborator. In NASA, we want all scientists to follow principles of open science. So we want this open science principles built into these agentic workflows. These workflows need to have human oversight and scientific accountability. So they need to have this notion of groundness and factuality check built into it, so that on the fly you can actually go do factuality checks on what has been generated to verify against known published literature or known technical documents. The system needs to be adaptable and extensible because the workflow, people can use bits and parts of the workflow. And the idea that it obviously has to be reproducible and provenance, though the reproducible here is, they're loose because it needs to focus more on repeatability part of it, that, people can go repeat the experiments that were created and get similar results and check whether the work was done correctly. These are just some links to existing resources if people are interested in learning more about some of these projects. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rahul. We take questions later. So next we'll hear from Andrew Turner, who's here with us. Andrew is the director and CTO of ESRI, Research and Development in Washington, D.C., developing new technology for open data, civic technology, and geospatial web collaboration. Andrew's work focuses on cross-domain collaboration and democratizing data-driven decisions by creating open tools for cartography and analysis. He wrote the introduction to NeoGeography based on his experiences and visions for a collaborative world with improved open data sharing. His teams are developing new technologies for government and citizens to build communities. This includes a global ArcGIS hub for open access of authoritative data. So that's why, of course, he's very well versed to speak here, as well as open source and interactive tools and applications to build and share insights and solutions. Andrew, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Take advantage of the podium. Just get the right screen sharing up. Great. Thank you. I just have some brief remarks to sharing some of the things and the patterns we're seeing with regards to the adoption of geospatial data and used in different AI techniques. There's a lot to cover, so I'll just be very brief about an overview. So just looking at what's interesting, what we're tracking is the evolution of geospatial data over time, going from papyrus and tablets to now the web, from DVDs that used to get shipped around once or every couple of years to now AI and probably in the near future, augmented reality, virtual reality, and other modalities. So it's obviously rapidly increasing. So we're trying to track how the data are being produced, how they're being consumed, and what we can do to enable people to analyze and use that data. What's changed now is the millions of authoritative sources that are live data services, right? So this is just a brief graphic of the open data being published by governments, nonprofits, of small local municipalities, regional governments, national governments, multinational organizations. And what's, again, really amazing about these is they're live, they're accessible, many of them or most of them are open, and they have metadata to varying qualities, which is why I was mentioning earlier some of the aspects of wondering about how we can keep improving metadata for things like allowing of use, privacy, things like that. Even very granular metadata about maybe certain attributes or geographies have different metadata than the whole data set. But it's great because it's amazing now all this data are now available, so we can now use it for analysis, but also a lot of new inferences and developing new models. The data becomes so complete now we can create things like this, the urban observatory that allows people to compare different geographic regions across times, across attributes, to see and start understanding, as was mentioned before, kind of a digital twin of the Earth from these live data sets. So, and this was done over a decade ago, so this wasn't even innovative to today, but the idea is just demonstrating how accessible the data are and what people can start doing to understand the world and compare policies, impacts, changes over time. So given that data now are available and authoritative, what can we do with it, especially with regards to emerging AI? Now, AI isn't new. It's been being developed over decades. But what's new about it is, again, how accessible it is, how we can run large models, small models, and integrate to different workflows. At Esri, we've developed and integrated hundreds of different models, from ones we've developed with our expertise, partnered up with different organizations, open source models. You start seeing open sourcing of models like you have of code, and really creating an innovative space where people are developing new models for different techniques. And what's amazing is you can now use it for all kinds of different applications and utilizations, whether it's just analyzing, understanding the data, with extracting it from textual and visual, auditory and other sources, analyzing it to find out patterns and behavior matching and simulations, and even creating new data, whether it's synthetic data or it's inferences or other, even just in the end, maybe new textual data that describes a scene or analyzes things like the impact from a disaster or building quality in a different area. So we're definitely seeing a wide array of how these data are being used and integrated to different workflows. And so I'll just highlight just a few. So when we look at different models, we start thinking about starting with the end in mind, and how specific is the task you need to do here. As Rahul mentioned, with the scientific application, but we also work with a lot of engineering, development, and policy-based ones. And so we work a lot to think about how the data integrated with models can do things like understanding land cover classification and analyzing things like changes in a place over time. Doing things like parking spot detections or parking lot detections, pool changes. Did someone actually build a new building and didn't file that with their local tax authority? To natural resources like oil spills and so on. So these are very task-specific pre-trained models that we're using usually authoritative data to answer very, very specific questions. Now, the quote is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. These are useful for these specific applications. But we also are seeing a lot of use of generalized pre-trained models. So these are ones where they might be more open-ended. They might use a mix of heterogeneous authoritative data, historic data with real-time, maybe less labeled data to answer general questions. So just describing, what do you see in this map? What do you see in this area? Helping it describe and get information out very quickly, possibly at a very large scale, around potentially even new questions. And so it's in this class where you start going from, quote, traditional AI into some of the new emergent generative AI applications. So this is what I know a lot of us are exploring now in our personal lives and in work and in applications. We're leveraging the textual data, the image data, the video data, tabular data a lot of different types of data formats now being used to generate and do inferences around questions, whether they're textual, language, or interactive. Now, these are mostly general purpose models. So they can have multiple tasks, which also, like any general purpose model, needs to be closely evaluated for its quality and accuracy for that task you're using it for at that moment. So we're definitely also starting to track where people are creating generative AI, small language models fit for purpose. So that's an emerging space that we're seeing and definitely interested to talk more about here. So one of the things that we're thinking a lot about how these different models and tools come together was highlighted here by the Director General of the Columbia Geographic Institute, that he believed the key reason we fail to achieve progress is that we choose to either ignore information we have or we don't use it enough. So important knowledge ends up being stored in complex interfaces and inaccessible databases. So this is an area that I'm particularly excited about, is how do we take all that data that's out there, make it really accessible and understandable for people to make better decisions, whether they're at a policy or national level, whether they're at a market level, or they're an individual resident or policymaker level. So some of the work we're doing now is really starting to integrate these different pieces together. So this is a quick demo. We worked with the County of Miami-Dade. They're dealing with heat impacts to their population. So what they were exploring was, how do you bring together geographic and geospatial data limited to their specific data to help a resident or a healthcare worker understand things like heat island effects and how it might affect people in their area. So this is a simple chatbot that they can embed on touchscreen kiosks at their local libraries and service centers, or people can explore on their mobile phone or on the web, about heat island effects, nearby hospitals that they need to respond to something, or make a policy about accessibility to existing hospitals, or even accessing that information in whatever language they're speaking, and being able to have those responses back in that language so someone can access that information independent of the language it was maybe captured in or being offered through their websites and web applications. You can also, what's really interesting here is also bringing together geographic and geospatial information with policy information and combining those things together. And it's that integration that we see also as a huge benefit here of not just answering questions spatially, but helping people understand what is a municipality, what's our policy around doing these things, and bringing those things together. So we're seeing this applied to a lot of different domains. So I mentioned and showed here about policy and local health, but we're also seeing it in applications of things like understanding zoning. Every day, cities and residents are trying to deal with, what can I do in my neighborhood? How is it changing over time? So if someone wants to ask about things like, what can I do in my certain neighborhood? All the answers now are being powered by this authoritative spatial data that's being shared from that municipality that they've curated to answer questions leveraging these task-specific models orchestrated through large language models. And we're seeing that as well in emergency preparedness and response, where time is of the essence, where they need to quickly access emergent data. They might not even know it's available. Being able to look at authoritative data, but then quickly being able to ask it in their own terminology, but accessing perhaps very specific geospatial data and get answers back that they can then look and track through that data, validate it through the authoritative data service, but make sure it's super easy to access. So these are just a few of the examples of things we're seeing around the access and sharing of data and how it can be integrated with some models. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. Next, we hear from Gangshan Mei. Gangshan is currently a tenure track assistant professor at the Department of Geography and the Environment, University of Texas at Austin. His research is spatially explicit artificial intelligence, geo foundation models, geographic knowledge graphs, and so on and so forth. Gangshan, please go ahead.
Do you want to share the screen? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, please go to the first. Yeah. Yeah, please go to the first page.
Got it.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's my honor to come here to present my recent research about novel AI applications on geospatial data. Especially, I want to talk about a specific technique called spatial representation learning. So I talk about what that concept means, how it works, and why it matters in the geospatial AI. So please. So before we talk about the spatial representation learning, we talk about what's a classic method when we handle geospatial data, especially vector geospatial data. So now we heard about a lot of things about how do we develop AI models for Earth observations, but what about geospatial vector data? So because traditionally we lack some representation learning method to handle vector data, so we have to do some compromised approaches. For example, the first way is feature engineering. Instead of input the vector polygon data into the neural network, we first seek to extract some features from these building polygons to do building pattern recognitions, or we have this vector database drainage patterns. We want to do drainage pattern classifications. We also have to allow the expert to define some feature from them. Another way to do so is to do data conversion. For example, when we want to do the map generalizations, instead of just directly using the vector building polygons, we convert them into raster images, or we convert map vector styles to raster images to perform map style transfer. The reason is because it's much easier to handle raster data with the existing neural networks, such as convolution neural network, vision transformer, and so on and so forth. However, there is some drawbacks for these both approaches. For example, for the feature engineering, the major limitation is it heavily rely on the domain knowledge. It's hard to generalize to new tasks and new regions. And for the data conversion approaches, when we convert from vector data to raster data, it leads to reduce data precisions and increase the storage requirement. And also it leads to modifiable error unit problems. So the problem is, okay, how do we handle this situation? So that comes to the idea of spatial representation learning. So basically the idea is to directly learning neural spatial representations of various types of spatial data in their native data format without the need for feature engineering and data conversion, which means like, okay, for raster data, it's very easy to handle by using CN or VIT. But for vector data, such as point, polyline, polygon, we have to develop some specialized neural network architecture. So we call location encoder, polyline encoder, and polygon encoder, which means we do not need to convert them into other data formats, such as convert polygon into raster data in order to allow the neural network to handle them, which clearly it has a lot of advantages because you do not need to have an expert to define feature from them because you have this model learn the feature by themselves. So can you continue? Yeah. So why it is so important? Because raster data and vector data are two fundamental data structure how we organize geospatial data. So now, if we have this representation learning techniques to handle the vector data, it has potential to be applied on a variety of different geospatial tasks. So here I list some of the examples I've been working on in my previous research, such as species distribution modeling, remote sensing image classification and segmentations, wealth index predictions, geographic question answering, weather forecasting, and PY type predictions. However, so one critical problem for the current spatial representation learning research is they are all individual effort, which basically means all the researchers are developing their own models, and they're hard to replicate. If a domain scientist want to utilize this model, it's very hard. So the idea is, how do we develop? Can you go to? How do we develop standard framework to provide for all the domain scientists to make them develop have an easier way to develop deep learning model to handle geospatial data? So this is the idea for the Torch Spatial, which is a deep learning Python framework for us to developing spatial representation learning models. So it has three components. The first one is a location encoding framework, which consolidates 15 different location encoders and necessary building block for you to develop location encoder. And the third component is a benchmark dataset, which includes 17 different datasets across which is serving a variety of different geospatial tasks. And the third component is evaluation framework. It can not only focus on the overall performance of the model, but also it can quantify the geographic bias, which I think is a very interesting term I want to discuss here. Please continue. So this is an illustration for the overall framework. So basically, given the data set we have geotagged images, either images, remote sensing images, or the ground level images, as well as has geo metadata. The image encoder is handle the image modalities, and location encoder is handle the location modalities. Because we have a variety of different image encoders coming from other, for example, Torch Vision packages, we will mainly focus on this part, which is location encoder. And by fusing the output from two encoders, we can perform different image regression and image classification tasks. But I want to emphasize that it's not the location encoder can be utilized on other non-image based tasks. Please continue. So what is location coding? Basically, it's a process of representing a location as a high dimensional vector, which we call its location embedding, such that it can be used for downstream tasks. So this highlights the general implementations of location encoder. So PE represents a deterministic position encoding, and neural network is a learnable neural modules. So please continue. So this table illustrates all the 15 location encoders we have implemented, including some of the models we have implemented before, as well as models implemented by other teams from Microsoft, from Google, and so on. We classified them in two types, for the 2D and 3D. Basically, location encoder can handle the Euclidean 2D coordinate, or it can be spherical coordinate, which indicates 3D. Please continue. So this table visualize all the data set we included in the benchmark dataset. It has 17 datasets and covers a wide range of geospatial tasks, such as fine-grained species recognitions, population density estimations, net illumination estimations, water quality index predictions, woman BMI predictions, and so on and so forth. Basically, this dataset is a way for us to evaluate, okay, how good the current model performed and whether they are as a global winner for across all these models. Please continue. But one interesting aspect I think most of the previous research neglect is, other than comparing the overall model performance, we also need to focus on the geographic bias, which is not only for the location encoder spatial representation learning research, but for generally for all the GeoAI models, because geographic bias is one of the unique characteristics inherent by all the GeoAI models. But very interestingly, there are no universal agreed definition for geographic bias. So here in this research, we define geographic bias as a phenomenon in which an AI model performs differently across geographic space, but its predictions are biased towards certain predominant regions. So just look at this figure. Basically, imagine this is a prediction of an AI model across a space. Basically, specifically, it's using one of the widely used remote sensing image classification dataset called functional map of the world. So here, the dots, each dot indicates one testing data images, and the color indicates the model performance. The red color indicates it's high performance. The model gives this test image a high performance. The blue color indicates a lower performance. We can clearly see from geographically, the model high performance point are clustered together, and low performance point also clustered together, which indicates, okay, this model actually has demonstrated a stronger geographic bias. This actually show, okay, we can quality show this model has geographic bias, but how exactly do we quantify them? The degree of geographic bias, that's the question we want to solve. So we said the low geographic bias means the possibilities of encountering wrong predictions is more uniformly across the region of interest. So given this, we call it a spatial point pattern of model performance. The question is, how do we compute a score to represent geographic bias? The problem is, can we use some classic spatial statistics measures, such as Marine's eye, Gary C, or LISA? But the problem is we cannot, because classic spatial autocorrelation statistics are not numerically comparable across patterns. For example, Marine's eye. We can use Marine's eye to see whether this pattern is significantly spatial autocorrelated, but we cannot compare the Marine's eye values between two patterns and see which one has a stronger spatial autocorrelation. Please continue. So in order to solve that, we developed a new measure called spatial self-informations, which the idea is we want to use Gaussian distributions to approximate the probability of observing certain type of spatial patterns. So now the key meanings is by using this measure, we can compare these two patterns to see which one has stronger spatial autocorrelation, because the lower probability it is, the less likely the current spatial pattern arise randomly, and consequently, it has stronger spatial autocorrelations. If this pattern represents a model performance, it indicates it has higher geographic bias. Please. So based on the SSI, we developed two scores. One is unmarked SSI, which indicate the intrinsic sampling geographic bias, regardless of the model performance. The marked SSI indicates the geographic bias, both considering a model performance as well as the data sampling error. So please go to the next slide. In our recent papers, we broadened the idea for geographic bias and defined 5 different metrics. And basically, both of the 5 metrics measure the geographic bias from very different angle. For example, whether it is in directional space, it is geographic biased, or from a distance measure, it is geographic biased. But as I said, the geographic bias is such a very general term, can not only be quantified on, for example, location encoder or spatial representation learning models, it can be utilized to quantify any geospatial AI models. So in this table, we compare 3 different geo foundation models on the well-known dataset called Euroset. So we have used 3 models, GPT-4o, the SetMAE, and also Chroma. So 3 widely used. This Chroma and SetMAE is 2 remote sensing visual foundation models. We can see that there is no clear relationship between the model performance and geographic bias. A model can be both highly performed, but they are highly geographic biased. But it can be vice versa, which is a very interesting observations. But interestingly, Stanford Foundation Model Laboratory, they have defined a collection of bias measures, which act as a gatekeeper to see for all the foundation model you produce, such as ChatGPT, whether they are biased towards gender or nationality and so on and so forth. But currently, there are no matrix for geographic bias. This effort is trying to fill this research gap. Please continue. So after we discuss the geographic, I just want to turn the gear to talk about how do we use spatial representation learning for geo foundation model development. So this is one of our recent papers about developing a multimodal foundation models by using the idea of geospatial alignment. So we have 3 modalities: the street view images, the satellite images, and the geographic locations. We can use 3 different encoders to represent them. We have the street view image representations, satellite image representation, and location representations. But the satellite images and street view images are not necessarily geo-aligned, which means, for example, the street view image location are not necessarily located at the center of the satellite images, which means we have to do some sort of spatial interpolation, but in the neural network space. In order to do that, we actually use a local ensemble interpolations, which means like, okay, given these representations, what the representation of satellite image at these locations, which corresponding to that satellite street view images. After this, 3 of these representations are geo-aligned. We can train them self-supervisedly by using contrasted learning objectives. Please go to next slide. So we evaluate this foundation model using 10 downstream tasks across 22 datasets. So for satellite images, we actually compare with some task where, like what the Terraman has tested before, for example, the burn scar segmentations, the cropland polygon segmentations, and crop type multi-temporal segmentations. For the location encoder, we actually compare against our location benchmark dataset. For stereo images, we are comparing against on tasks such as human perception regressions, social economic indicator regressions, and so on and so forth. And this table, please go to next. This table illustrates the results. So we compare our model against various geospatial foundation models, as well as some task-specific foundation models. Task-specific GeoAI models, which indicates the advantages of using the idea of geo-alignment to train the foundation models, which become new novel objectives compared with such as mask autoencoders or mask language modeling. Please go to next slide. So that's all I want to present. The key takeaways is I think spatial representation learning is one of the key components for geospatial AI model development, where the geographic bias is a unique and important issue for us to quantify when you want to develop GeoAI foundation models. And if you develop geo foundation models, the spatial representation learning should be a key component to consider incorporate into the model architecture. But other than the geo-bias issue I have discussed before, there are other geoethical concepts, for example, geo-privacy, spatial temporal replicability, and explainability. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for these very interesting discussions and presentations. We'll now, I think we'll go up front, yeah? Okay, great. So let's open it up for questions. First, I have a bunch, but first from the room. Of course, yeah, any questions here in the room? Keith?
Hi, Keith Masbach on the committee. I think all of you, you touched on really thought-provoking examinations that go beyond, hey, AI is going to be great for geo, right? I think we can all sort of agree to that. I think it got down into the next level of understanding bias of working across multiple platforms to be able to have that harmonized approach. So I don't know if there's a question in here as much as I found it very interesting that I spend so much of my time in meetings where this is all treated at a very superficial level. And I'm heartened by the fact that there are those of you who are thinking more deeply about this and putting research time and effort into it so that we'll get to a place of better usefulness and understand the impact of potential for bias, understand the broad number of inputs we have that Kevin articulated earlier, and Raul that you touched on, having this problem of all these data inputs. How do we start to have things that are broadly applicable? So I mostly just want to say I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I think it's important that we collectively surface this so that we can get beyond the geo's good with AI thing. Thanks.
More questions? Well, do you have any comments on that?
Oh yeah. So in terms of like thinking about whether we have a discussion across different colleagues about whether we should consider geospatial is special for AI model development. We have a paper discussing, for example, if the AI whether it is better to develop a general purpose model, we're just treating geospatial data as just as a normal data set with others, or if we want to develop what we call spatially explicit AI models, which consider the geospatial aspect. Of course, most of the paper trying to say, oh, geospatial is special, and because the motivation is you want to publish a paper, and also you want to emphasize, oh, spatial data is special. But since in some cases, we also observe that in some tasks, in some downstream task, if you emphasize too much of the weight, if you develop the spatial explicit AI, then the model will become much more complex, and it's hard to generalize to other, for example, tasks. Yeah, but I just want to, yeah.
Okay, any other comments? Maybe Rahul or Andrew?
Yeah, I want to chime in a couple things. So I think first to your comment, Keith, is first, yeah, it's the use of AI with geospatial is actually very mature, but there's always new emerging techniques and processes. And I want to harken back to actually, Rahul mentioned a couple things around like the phrase I from my notes was model selection, where I think what's interesting here, while there's some analytical techniques, geospatial analytic techniques that are very well established, when to use them, how to use them, that's probably the fuzziest thing right now with AI is when to use which. And then as Gong Chung was just saying, even when do you design which? So ultimately it'll be systems of systems, right? Multiple models orchestrated together. That's, I think, probably what the new emerging practices need to help define. And Gong Chung mentioned a little bit about different ways to test those things. I think because some of these things are non-deterministic, they're quote black boxes. There's a lot of questions there. Rahul, I'm actually curious, you mentioned the idea as a scientist, understanding the model. And I think a lot of people would love to do that. But when you can't understand the model, what's sufficient testing around it to know its appropriateness of use for with certain data for certain applications becomes one. And ultimately, could you wrap that again in like a AI to help you choose that from thousands of models?
Rahul, you have any comments on this?
Yeah, no, this is a great point. I think, when we started building these geospatial foundation models, the hope was there'll be few foundation models that could be used by the community. But I think right now, I think there are over 100 foundation models, which is a good thing. I think there's value in it. That's why people are building it. And the selection of the right foundation model for your particular application, as Andrew was mentioning, is a challenge. I think the approach that people have been taking is building benchmarks, like a standard benchmark that you can compare, which I think is a great idea. But I think in remote sensing, especially for science applications, it can be very nuanced. I think Gauchen mentioned like it's, like sampling strategy would be different from how one model was built versus the other. And it can have, nuances that you'll have. I think that's why I personally think explainability of these models is important in addition to benchmarks, that you need to understand what went into the model, what were the design constraints of the model, assumptions were made. And it's like any other tool, you have to learn how to use it correctly. I think we need to make an effort to, provide explainability right from the beginning, rather than giving it as a big black box with the humongous parameters and claim that it can do everything.
Actually, Rahul, could I follow up on this? You said there are now 100 foundation models. So that begs the question, right? What is a foundation model, or are there some models which are more foundational than others? Yeah, so maybe it was an unfortunate term which was used. Anyway, I would like to hear maybe the comments of everyone. From you first, maybe.
Okay. Yeah. I think, unfortunately, I think everyone has a different perspective on what the model would be useful for. So I think, when we started, we were like, hey, can we make our HLS data set more useful to the community? So we want to build a foundation model based on that so that the community that's already downloading that data can utilize it in different applications. So that was the thought process behind it, right? I think ideally it'd be nice that we collaborate and build a few foundation models that cover certain kinds of sensor characteristics. I think that's what we are trying to do with ESA with this joint collaboration and see if we can, work together and build few good models that serve a wide community. As most of you know, building these models is expensive. It's computationally expensive. It's bad for the environment. Also, we're using so much compute. So I think we have to be a little bit more judicious about this.
Yeah, just to react to that. Yeah, I think the term foundation model it's ambiguous. So I'd caution against getting wrapped up around what that is versus just thinking about them as models. They have different fits for uses, especially maybe foundational just means expensive model. But yeah, I think mostly it's about just thinking about how the models are either. What's nice about all these models is like which one can you use and which ones can be tunable. So even the quote foundation models, right? Whether the big LLMs, they usually can be tuned. You're seeing. I know a lot of the tools we do, we'll take an open source model and then we'll tune it for a specific use case. Like I use the building example, like buildings in Tucson look very different than buildings in DC, look very different than buildings in Wichita, than Seattle, right? So you might want to tune it for those application scenarios. The nice thing is you don't have to start from scratch. You can start with those. So maybe if you think of a foundational one, it's more of a generalized one that can be specialized as a way that would be a really useful pattern for people to think about. Two other questions I was just thinking about as we're talking was, I don't know if there's anything out there for AI specific metadata, right? Raul, you're mentioning about or understanding what data went into it, what methodology. Right now, we would just apply normal metadata to it. Is there a specific profile that might be AI specific to really capture some aspects that might be relevant to AI? Maybe not, maybe a general metadata models work. The other one is you kept mentioning, or there's a lot of competition out there in the model space. There's leaderboards in one place called Hugging Face. I wonder if there would be a way for the community to start like a geo model leaderboard, right? Just kind of a friendly competition, right? It's interesting. They're all out there like who can actually train the better model for what use case, which is really just helping people teach what it's good for, what's better for certain applications, just different ways people could find those as they're applying it to different tasks.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I thought a little bit about that. I think there are two in streams. One is, for example, we develop one model for each task and each data set. Another extreme is we develop just one model for all the tasks across biologies, for chemistry, for medical, for geography, and so on and so forth. But currently, clearly, we are seeking a more like a middle route where we've developed foundation models, not for all the tasks, but a subset of them to because the benefits is for some of the data set or some of the problems, they have very limited annotations, and it is very hard, for example, to achieve acceptable performance where you can leverage the models, leverage the knowledge from other domains on relative data set to help you to fill the gap, to allow the teach the model even without any annotations. You have a general common sense understanding of the world to do the reasoning. That's, I think, the major goal for foundation model development. So for example, in many Earth system science problems, there's only one observation every month or every year. But if you have some satellite images or if you have other environmental observations, it helps to keep the gap and improve the model performance even without any label data. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, are there any other questions here in the room? Oh, yes, sorry.
Thanks. Marguerite Madden. Raul, when you mentioned human in the loop, that really caught my attention because I do tell my students all the time when they're modeling or doing anything, they need to put eyes on the intermediate steps and the final product. And so I just wondered what that looks like, how you envision that working. And I had a small idea seeing Genchen, you put those QR codes all through your presentation. So could we have model results that have the QR code that links to a web page that asks people what they think about this, or what is the bias, or, just getting feedback maybe. I don't know, that's just kind of a crazy idea, but so maybe Raul, you have a much more scientific way to do that.
None of the feedback part of it. We tend to get comments on, where people can download the models in terms of things that they want the model to do. And, let me back up. I think one thing I want to specify, like when we were building the models, we always start with science use cases first. We want to understand what problems we can solve, wide variety of problems. And if only, we see that there is a wide variety of problems we can solve, then only we focus on building a model. Otherwise, you're basically building a specialized model, right? I think that's one thing that we look at. I think on the agent workflow, I think this is happening now in terms of, how we will end up using agents, how we are using AI. I think we as researchers have an opportunity now to shape these systems, at least for science, so that those principles, the science rigor, those principles are built into the systems that, future students will use, right? Like having a human in the loop, being able to stop and check every step and see, what was done, be able to roll back to certain steps, rather than, build black boxes that we basically just give it some objective and get some results and we are happy with the results. So I think it's really important now, I think, especially on the agent side, what's happening, that we basically push for these requirements into the systems.
Okay. Let me ask one question. There's also a really good question on the chat, but if I could ask one question. Oh, sorry. You hear me? Yeah. Good. The question is, there was quite a lot of discussion about, can we figure out what these models learn? Raul, you talked about it. We talked about biases. And we all know, of course, biases can be introduced on the foundation model side through the data sets, but then also through the pre-training, right? What am I pre-training it for? In fact, if I don't pre-train it correctly, then I will not capture what I really want to capture. And so that is a huge bias. And so maybe you could say a little bit about the challenges of figuring out how you should pre-train, especially considering that you have, of course, the spatial features, you have the temporal features, you have the features in the modalities, you have the features spectrally or across your different channels, etc. So maybe just one sentence from everyone, maybe.
Yeah, that's an excellent questions. So when we first think about the bias, there is a lot of like bias and debiasing literatures. One issue we think about is, yes, there are representation bias, there are data bias, there are also model bias. The way how we think about it is, for example, how do we, I think what you are asking is, how does geographic bias, how much it come from the data part, how much come from the model training part, and how do we quantify the, one way I can think about is, for example, you can develop some debiasing strategies and employ on different self-superlearning objective and see, for example, for different pre-training, which one is more effectiveness and which one, even if you add it, if you mitigate the bias but broken the model, make the model performance very poor, that may be one indicator. But as far as I know, there is no like a clear evaluation to separate these two sources of the bias. Yeah.
Any other comments, Raul? You have one?
Yeah, I think, your point is right. I think there are, the link I have to that primer kind of steps into that, the different dimensions you have to look into before to understand the model. Obviously, the input data is one, what you're using to pre-train. I think how you sample it is a very important. I think this was also presented. I think how you structure the data before you feed into the model. You can basically tell by that what model will learn and what it won't learn. For example, you have a model that you basically just fed in one time step, right? So you're basically just giving spectral information and spatial information, but just one time step. And you're trying to apply it to a problem that is temporal in nature and classification. Yeah, right off the bat that this is the wrong model for it. You don't need a benchmark to do it, right? So these are like simple things that you can basically go, this is what I want students to learn, is like simply look at the model and understand what's going in it, where it'll work, where it'll not work. You're using time steps, like in the next 3 days of time step. You cannot use it for seasonal prediction, right? It's only you're using a wrong time period for it. So just things like that are really important. I think we have to be transparent about these things, right? These assumptions that were used when you're pre-training the model.
Okay, so yeah, we have a really good question online by Bruno, who's actually on the next. I think Bruno, you could probably ask if you turn on right. You could, right? He's a panelist. You could ask the question yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. So I'll speak later, so I'll do the intro later. But the question itself is, we have a lot of data about Earth from constellations like the ones from NASA or ESA. And it seems that with AI, we have the tool to understand that data. Floods, fires, anywhere, anytime. But then it's clearly obvious we are falling short of the impact that could have in the world. Why?
I think, Andrew, that's a question for you.
I think it's actually it's a provocative question to say it is. Now, I guess I'll just pivot it saying there could definitely be more being done. But I think we covered that a little bit. I mean, we're definitely ultimately it needs to get into the hands of quote decision makers, people who are performing tasks, doing actions, right? So, there's a big gap between doing research, even doing engineering and development, to actually applying and doing it. And I think making the data more accessible, the models accessible, and then combining the models with the data into tools people are using, right? So there's in software development, there's a phrase, meet the user where they are. So I think, Bruno, to your point, that's always the biggest gap is where's the person, what are they doing, how do we get these tools into their hands? Raul, you mentioned the word like knowledge discovery, that's one, right? But I think also the idea that it might be acting, right? That's the idea of AI going to the aspect of agents. Does it actually do something on my behalf? Which right now we're definitely being hesitant around because that's where it all of a sudden gets out of hand. But I think that's to the point is how can it actually be applied to doing more quote on the ground where that impact will be is definitely where it's going by integrating them.
Any other comments on that? Okay, so I think I want to thank the panelists. Let me just say one thing, maybe that's a good way to close is, I think Raul talked about SI as a tool, right? AI as a collaborator. I don't think we got quite to AI as a means to disseminate information, but maybe the next meeting we could have is AI as a discoverer. And so anyway, that's a great evolution. Yeah, thanks so much to everyone on the panel, and we'll take 10 minutes break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Break and start again at 4 p.m.
Hello, everybody. My name is Marguerite Madden. And in the next session, we'll hear from two speakers on applications of geodigital data from various sectors. Each speaker is going to speak for about 10 minutes. And after all the speakers have presented, we'll have 25 minutes for questions from the committee or the webinar audience and a broader discussion with all the speakers. So our first speaker is Bruno Sanchez Andrade Nuno. Bruno is the executive director of CLAY, the AI for Earth nonprofit, where he focuses on making AI learn Earth with open source, open data, and open for business. He co-founded and leads the project. And previously, Bruno co-founded and directed the planetary computer at Microsoft. His past roles also include leading data projects at the World Bank and chief scientist at Mapbox, emphasizing his extensive experience in technology and environmental and social impact. Bruno, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to mention that in 2010, many years ago, I was a Mir-Sayam Fellow of the National Academies. So I don't know if there is any in the room. I don't see the room, but it was incredibly useful to me and an incredible opportunity granted by the academies. So thank you for that. It really reshaped my whole professional career. It was a turning point for stop seeing research or science as only research and focusing a lot more on impact, on operational value, which in a way, it's the main point of what I'm trying to share. I'll try to give a lot of time for questions because I think it's the most important part. But the punchline to me is that, and to answer specifically the questions of this session, which is how to build trust and what is the role of AI, I would say that when it comes to geospatial data and AI, we seem much better at creating academic trust or academic value than operational impact. And I've seen that across the roles I've had that you've presented from Mapbox to the World Bank to building the planetary computer, and now with fully on AI. And it's that I kept thinking it was about making, putting the data together or showing what it can be done and trusting that. But what I realized over and over again is that in general, and I will try to be opinionated to drive the discussion, I don't think we have a trust problem with geospatial data. I think we are, and that's because partly on a great part, because geospatial data comes to great degree to defense and security skills and defense and security operations, which are inherently trusted for their requirements. What I do think we have is practical trust because we don't have the skills needed to extract that value, and the products we have are not the right products. And they are great. Many of the geospatial products are out there, they are great if you have those skills. And the problem is that you have to have those skills. And then you put AI on the mix. And the problem is even greater, because now not only you need to have the skills to understand geospatial data, but also AI data. And one of the things we did later is to create this foundational model called CLAY. And it's similar to the ones that Rahul, for example, was sharing with Prithvi or IBM with Terraform. And they're great. They are fantastic. They are orders of magnitude faster, better, and cheaper to do many of the outputs. And we've seen many examples, which I'm going to mention in a second. But the punchline to me here is that despite all of that effort, despite all of the budget that we get with Clay, we were able to raise $6 million to make a completely open source open data. And we spend it all, right? And it works. It's amazing. But we don't have the impact that we know we could have, as I was asking the question to the previous panel. And I think the root of that is what I mentioned, is the lack of skills and the lack of a product to enable that impact. At some point, we made some estimate that maybe 80,000 people in the world could actually understand Clay or other models because of the skills. You don't have the tool or the driver to have an impact if that's such a small set of people who can actually leverage that model. Some examples that we've seen with Clay, and remember that Clay is fully open, so we only know if they tell us. And right, because they just need to communicate to us, the license is completely open. For example, we knew one of the points for the legal aspects of the first keynote, our license was open, but it was not well known. And we had to change the license so that the open license we used was a pre-approved license. Because if it's not one of the pre-approved licenses, it makes the work hard, because then the institution that wants to use the model needs to have a legal review to see if that open license is actually open or has complications. So that's one of the practical things that we saw. But the usual examples that Rahul could have said, and Earth Genome and IBM and others that are institutions that are doing similar models to us, is that it is extremely fast and extremely cheap once you have the model to, for example, detect fires, detect floods, detect the biomass, the carbon above ground, or the biomass of forest, or to detect features like, I don't know, detect hospitals or parking lots, or all of those things are incredibly good. They're not perfect. So from the 0% to 80% quality, you get extremely fast and cheaper results. And then from the 90 to the 100%, you might need to go to the if you need those accuracies. And that is good news. And I'm going to share my screen to just 3 slides. And I will share the screen. And hopefully you can see a table. Can someone, I don't see the room, so can someone say if you see a table?
We do.
Okay,
Yes,
great. So this is the table from a recent paper of the benchmarks. And that was all one of the things that was mentioned before, that maybe we have a leaderboard that exists on the academic sense. And that is the point. A lot of these models, they are different to the decimal point. So then it begs the question, are they good enough? Or are they all bad, but the same? To me, the bigger question is not that there are many models and there seem to be different in the unit or even the decimal point, is that this is not the driver of impact. To me, the driver of impact is that, is this model usable? Do I need internet? Can I run it offline? What is the license? What data can I use with this? One of the key reasons we created Clay is because there was no foundational model that could accept any data. Train with Landsat, but what if I have planet data? Train with planet, what if I have drone data? One of the key reasons we created Clay was to be practically agnostic, practically driven. And to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the room, remains the only large open model that allows to do that. We focus on that operational value, not on the academic theme, not because it's bad to do academia, but that was our goal. There are good news. And the use cases that we've seen, not only done by us, but also by others, is that not only is possible, but it's faster and cheaper. What used to take $10 million and 5 years, Global Forest Watch, rough estimates, now can take 100K and 1 month. And it's, if you think about it, Global Forest Watch and Amazon Mining Watch or Global Plastic Watch, it's the same thing. It's finding a semantic in the data. That's what we, at the end of the day, a lot of the use cases of the geospatial data is about that. It's about finding something on the vast scale of Earth. And we're getting better. And we can get much better with the recent revolution of AI. And just to drive a whole context of how things are evolving, in my opinion, is that when it comes to AI understood as text, like think of ChatGPT, we had custom models that came foundational models like the GPT, and then we were able to figure out how to fine-tune them for specific operations. And then we realized that one of the fine-tunes was to to what humans liked. So we invented the reinforced learning human feedback, which is to make the foundational model liked by humans, and that's ChatGPT. Then we understood agents and MCP. The point here is that regardless if it was a good idea or not, especially the private sector decided to spend a ton of money, a ton of resources to make these models better and better and better. And GeoAI has been able to benefit from that. We could have chosen other things, but many of the innovations on text AI are used for geospatial. But we seem to be unable to go from academic papers to operational use. We seem good at making foundational models like Clay and others, but we are not seeing that operational use. And I think it's because we are focusing too much on the fine-tune applications, where in my opinion, and this is a whole kind of discussions, we should focus on something else, which is the embeddings. And that's my last message for my notes, is that embeddings, which is a representation of the data. You can imagine like you have an image and then you convert that to an embedding, is a vector. It's just a bunch of numbers. And the key point is that those numbers are a semantic summary. The concept of fire, the concept of flood, the concept of 10 kilos of wheat, it's somewhere in that vector. And the idea is that to the degree those embeddings are useful, then fundamentally change the entire space of geospatial. Why? Because understanding things on images is expensive. It's computer vision. It's pixel math. It takes a lot of compute, a lot of effort to do that. But we know how to work with vectors very well and very fast. So the question of how many fires are there in the world right now, if you have the embeddings of the whole world, it would literally take seconds. It wouldn't take months. It would take seconds to query that vector on the whole world to do that. But we need to convert those images. So the use case that I'm talking about, the thing that we are super excited for fundamentally changing geospatial and driving practical trust, involves changing how we work with geospatial data. Where we had the thing at the top of this slide of using labels, doing some models, custom research, assess, maybe run the models, some computer vision thing, come back to it, then ask for an expert, all of those things. Then now is, if you have the embeddings, ask the questions in second, get a result. Provide some human feedback, get a result. Literal and iterative process in seconds, not months. This is a real example of a company who was trying to find certain asset in the US, and we were able to save them orders of magnitude in full-time people working on this and budgets. That to me is the answer to the questions of how do we build trust, is that I don't think we have so much of a trust in the data, but practical trust. And the reason is because we need a lot of skills and a lot of improvements in the product to drive practical trust and usage. And AI's role, in my opinion, leans a lot on this vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Well, we'll hold questions until the end. Our second speaker is Keith Masbeck. He is the owner of Plum Run LLC, which provides advisory and consulting services to startups, small companies, and government organizations working with geospatial intelligence and related fields. Previously, he spent more than 10 years as president and chief executive officer of the USGIF, U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Foundation, establishing a professional certification program and substantially increasing the number of other accredited academic programs. Before joining USGIF, he had more than 20 years as an officer in the U.S. Army and as a government civilian employee, culminating in the senior executive service at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. Many of his positions involve planning, acquiring, and tasking airborne and spaceborne remote sensing assets for military and intelligence purposes. And he's currently the lead for Earth Fire Alliance, an NGO. Keith, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Marguerite. I'm thrilled to sort of clean up here the last presentation of the day before we start thinking about looking across the entirety of the day. I am a lead of the Earth Fire Alliance, and I'm going to walk you through a little bit about what the alliance is and what we're endeavoring to embark upon. I'm very excited personally because it feels like the single most important thing I'll ever do professionally. Marguerite touched on some of the things I've done, and this really feels like the culmination of all those things have prepared me to do this. And so I'm happy to share it with you today. Slide, please. Earth Fire Alliance is indeed a global coalition. The idea is to understand, characterize what's going on around the Earth with respect to fire. We don't understand today the extent of fire on the planet. We don't understand what fire is doing to the planet. We don't understand what fire is doing in terms of what's happening because of smoke, what's happening because of additional impacts of fire. And so we hope to be able to provide that transformative data that will finally allow for a holistic understanding of what's going on the planet. So we have built the Earth Fire Alliance. It's a little bit over a year old. A key program, our first program, is the FireSat program. It is purpose-built, the first of its kind, to be focused on wildfire. And it will provide the data that we want to provide through the Earth Fire Alliance. And our intent, at least initially, is to be able to provide that to first responders, fire researchers, and fire scientists globally, so that we can begin to get our arms around the problem. Bruno, I appreciate you talking about the ability to apply models to the data, and we're very excited to do that with some of our partners. Slide, please. So just numbers, when the satellite is in its full configuration, there would be about 50 satellites that would provide 20-minute revisit anywhere on the globe. We have 5 bands of multispectral imaging with 6 channels, which should get us down to 80-meter resolution. And we have a requirement from our discussions with first responders and wildfire fighters and incident managers to keep the false positive rate under 5%. So that's one of the stressing conditions. We should be able to cover 99% of the areas of the Earth that have wildfires. We do intend to have our initial operating capability, our first 3 of our 50 satellite constellation, up by Q2 of 2026. We launched our first satellite in March of this year. It's a prototype satellite. It's got the full sensor package on it. Everything is operating nominally at this point, and I think we should see the first images of fire from that satellite within the next 30 to 60 days. We expect to have the full 50 satellite constellation up by 2029. But so it's sort of the prototype satellite followed by the first 3 of the operational constellation, and then there'll be a launch campaign to get us the rest of the way. Slide, please. This is representative data of what we'll see across the bands, because it's important to be able to both characterize and understand what's happening with the fire, but not to get have your sensor blown out by the intensity of the fire and what you're collecting against. So most other systems, and I'll talk to this a little bit later, have been built for other purposes and then sort of do support to wildfire fighting as what I'd refer to as a side hustle, a really important side hustle, and they've contributed significantly over time. And as I'll mention, we expect to be able to interoperate with those which will still exist as we build out our constellation. Slide, please. We expect to be able to deliver 4 product types. The idea is we want them to be seamlessly fit into current operational architectures. We don't want to impose a lift onto operational firefighters. We want them to be able to ingest it into their native systems. So it'll be fire perimeter, the ability to understand exactly where the perimeter of the fire is. understand, measure, and characterize fire radiative power, so the true intensity of the fire, and understand intensity within the fire. To be able to track fire progression over time, and you can imagine, to Bruno's comments, when you start combining soil moisture and fuel types and terrain, that you can begin to have a really good understanding of fire behavior in a way that we've never been able to have before. And then finally, hotspot detection, which gives relatively immediate warning to operational firefighters of where things are flaring up and where change is happening within the fire perimeter. Slide, please. This gives you an idea of the space-based capabilities that are up there now. This slide was built in response to questions about that. And again, we see it holistically. There are benefits and drawbacks to each of these systems in terms of timeliness, and in terms of resolution, in terms of availability. So you can kind of see how we compare down on the bottom to the current systems, and look forward to integrating those. That's that idea under the hat of Earth Fire Alliance, that it's not all about FireSat. It is about understanding that there's more fire on the Earth than we can characterize today, and every asset we have that can be put against it, all the analytics that can benefit from that, the better. Slide, please. So this is where I've talked. When you look at states, when you look at countries that are working with dealing with the wildfire challenge, there are in situ cameras on poles and things like ranger stations. There are even people who volunteer to stand in ranger stations and characterize and look for fire. There are multimodal aircraft that are in play. We intend to provide FireSat. There's some assets from the previous slide. And FireGuard, which is actually a use of classified U.S. national assets, where that data is put out in an unclassified form and usable for firefighters and incident commanders. Slide, please. We do have our protoflight satellite up now, FireSat 0. It's got the full up sensor package on it, as I mentioned. We've been very deliberate with our partners at Muon Space, who built the spacecraft, to slowly commission the spacecraft. This, in terms of my career, where we have been involved in the requirements process for and launch and operation of systems that were hundreds of millions of dollars, and we never had the luxury of a prototype satellite to be able to go up. And so it's really remarkable to have the full sensor package up there and be able to understand that. So again, you can see across the bottom, launch in March, currently going through commissioning and checkout. We'll see the first fire imagery soon. We'll start getting data packet delivery to our early adopters that we have globally. And then that will inform, as we're already building the first 3 satellites of the objective constellation, which will go up next year. Slide, please. So Earth Fire Alliance was established in 2024. We did have a running start. FireSat, the concept of FireSat was percolated within the Environmental Defense Fund. And when it was clear that it had operational utility, the funders and EDF felt that it needed to have a different construct than what they've done today with MethaneSat. And so that's what precipitated the stand-up of the Earth Fire Alliance as a home for FireSat. And this is, what I've talked about through the course of the presentation. 3 satellites will actually give us 12-hour revisit. They'll be in sort of a train coming by every 3 hours, but they'll be able to give us the data and coverage for several selected key geographies globally, and then we'll get to the full-up constellation. Slide, please. This is really all about openness and collaboration. It's about looking for partners. We are working with a number of other nonprofit organizations. We understand that this data, this unprecedented data, will really make a significant impact on what we understand about fire and fire science and how wildfires behave. So we're very excited by this. We have a global set, as I said, of early adopters, from very sophisticated users like CAL FIRE in the United States, and fire authorities in Portugal, and New South Wales in Australia, as well as Tasmania. And we are working now to sign up some early adopters in Africa and South America, And it'd be really important for us to have a broad set of users from very sophisticated to those that have not necessarily dealt with data like this before, so we can make sure that it is equitable and transformative for all. So that's all I've got with respect to the Earth Fire Alliance and FireSat. I look forward to sharing more progress with you, and certainly when we get those first fire images soon, we'll be sharing those loudly and proudly.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Bruno. I know that I really appreciate learning about clay in Earth Fire Alliance. So do we have any questions here in the room? Hendrik?
Yeah, I have a question for, I think for Bruno. I mean, I like this idea, of course, thinking about embeddings and as representations, right, of very large data sets. And I also like the idea, of course, that you focus on really practical matters. So for me as a technical person, I would say, well, it's very difficult to create the entire content of these very rich data sets into these embeddings. In fact, I would argue it's probably not possible today, just prohibitive in terms of what we can do, right? I'm not saying we will not be able to do it. But then my question to you is, and I think even if that is incomplete, right? To what extent can we have impact with maybe embeddings who are not perfect? Because we may not want to wait till they're perfect, right? That's your question.
That's the answer. Henrik, thank you for the question. And the answer is the second part of the answer is the second part of the question, which is that, yes, I know embeddings are not perfect, even by definition and by practice. We don't know if these embeddings are 80% of what they could be or 20% of they could be. We are learning how to make these embeddings, and we are learning how to use these embeddings, which I think they are different to others. They are even lossy encoders. They are not going to be perfect. But, and this is the biggest question, and this is why we are thankful for the partners and donors who gave us the money to build the nonprofit and the investors to now build the for-profit, which is, to the degree embeddings are useful universally, to the degree that they can answer those questions, they will answer those questions thousands of times faster and cheaper than before, which also means that the impact is going to be much bigger, because just like in ChatGPT, you can ask about explaining quantum physics in Swahili. There are no books of quantum physics in Swahili, I think. I don't know. But the point is that it understands the semantics and is removing the barrier to get a lot of value from that. So the embeddings, even if they are not perfect, they would enable so much value to people that don't have those skills. Yes, we need to build the products to ensure that there's quality and all of those things, but I am extremely excited for the prospect that this might work. It is a risk, of course, and it's not going to be perfect, of course, but to the degree that they work, I think it's going to change the world.
So you see a future where we eventually go to Copernicus and can just pick up the embeddings ready to go and build our models versus what we're doing today, right? Where we're sitting hours to download data. Yeah, is that what you're?
Yes, I wouldn't say, and it's an open call that I've made in many other venues, which is for ESA and NASA and others to choose one model. Doesn't really matter. I think it doesn't really matter that much. Make embeddings for all your data and then see the explosion of utility, just like when NASA made Landsat open data and there was a massive explosion of value. I put pause to this room that we will see that explosion of value when we have those embeddings, when we understand how they work, when we understand what value we can get.
Thank you.
So I think you and Keith should talk. You could be the first. You could be embedding your FireSat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have other questions from the room? Yes, Genshin.
I have a question for the FireSat system. It's very impressive to see you provide a whole ecosystem from the satellite images for the FAIR parameters as well as the FAIR progressions. I understand that other than the satellite observation, there will be a huge effort on annotating the data set, verification of the data set, as well as measuring the whole dynamics. Could you talk a little bit about how do you ensure for example, the trustworthiness about this annotation process? I think that's actually very critical from a downstream application perspective. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I sort of in my remarks focused on the operational downstream early adopters, right? And the fact that we're going to put things into native formats that they're used to, whether it's an Esri platform or a Google Earth platform, or other standard tools that they're going to have at their disposal and that they're used to working with. I'm going to go back to the requirements process, which was interviews with over 200 first responders, fire researchers, fire modelers, because we wanted to understand what their requirements were. We narrowed it down to those products because we know we can deliver those very quickly, but that level 1 data, other data is certainly going to be available in the larger data sets. Google.org is one of our funders. I mentioned EDF's involvement. The Minderoo Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation have all supported our work. Through Google.org, Google Research is very eager to get involved and has been associated with FireSat since it was percolated out of the Environmental Defense Fund. So they're very eager to get their hands on the data set and start to see what they can do with it and how they can train models on it as well. In that early adopter cohort, we have fire scientists and we have researchers and we have modelers, and we are eager to give out data sets to them, to let them work on it, to give us feedback about how we're going to apply the data in the future and just what the best approach is to being able to serve that data up. Does that answer your question? It's easy to get. I've spent most of my life as the ground user and requirements determiner of space systems. And I even find myself getting so focused on the space system that sometimes, which is horribly ironic, that I give short shrift to the downstream and the analytics piece of this, because I agree with everything you said.
Keith, actually, we have an online comment that might help you out with that. This is from Bruce Crawford. For Keith, I didn't see any focus on improving the resolution on smoke plume tracking. Is that a worthwhile application? And could you imagine the kinds of future analytic products and applications might emerge from that effort if it were to be pursued?
Yeah, there are a number of things. We're attempting to narrow the scope, right, with FireSat Zero, and focus on the things that we understand the requirements very definitively, and to be able to get those products out, and then to get those data sets out. There's other things that come up routinely, like the ability to monitor embers and ember cast, right? And so we know that getting it into the data into the hands of researchers is going to open up a number of things. We've had people talk about, as people hear about what we're doing and they understand what the sensor is going to be capable of doing, we're getting inbounds all the time. And it's just right now a matter of staying focused on delivering from FireSat Zero as a pathfinder for the rest of the constellation. But I think we're just truly beginning to understand the broad application of what this data is going to be able to, the applications that, yeah, it's going to provide.
I also think that's related to Bruno's comments about the lack of skills. So skills, but also just experience, doing this. So they'll feed off each other, I believe. Any other questions from here? Yes.
Sorry, I'm not one of the 80,000 persons that understand this. So it will be helpful to me if you can give an example of what Margaret was saying. If you had to embed the information from the fire Bruno, what would you like? What do you embed? The size of the of the ambers, the temperatures. What information will need to be translated into vectors? As an example, so we understand what embedded means.
Oh, yeah, this is a great question. The idea is that models like Clay and others, they take the image and then they create a vector, this embedding, and then the whole job is to recreate back the input image only with that embedding and then compare what the reconstruction. So then, by definition, that embedding is trying to convey everything on that image. It's not focusing on fires, it's not focusing on anything, it's focusing on everything at once, because the task is to recreate the whole thing. So the idea is that those embeddings are universal. They are all of those things at once. They are stem cells, if you will. So if you want to use embeddings for fires, what you do is you take a few examples of embeddings from Sentinel or Firesat or others, and understand how those embeddings, with those few examples, understand where is fire encoded in those dimensions. And once you understand how is fire encoded, then you can use it everywhere else with some degree of usability. And the key point is that if you then want to do floods, or if you want to do harvest predictions, you use the exact same embeddings. So the cost, the vast majority of the cost is creating those universal embeddings. And then you can apply it for other things. That, I hope that makes a +1 on the 80,000, and then it's 80,001.
You're trying to digitalize all that information that today is pixels and translate it into an equation very complex.
I'm trying to make an index, like a librarian that has an index of the Library of Alexandria. So if you want to know fires, oh, they are in this and this place because I have it on my semantic index, right? That's how I'm thinking sometimes about it.
Thank you.
And that approach, right, will be what allows for the integration of other sensors, other sensor types, what we can get from synthetic aperture radar, what we can get from electro-optical, what LiDAR sensors will provide, the ground to air to space. When we have that common framework, then that begins to unlock the ability to put all that together. And
a closing comment, Margaret, if I may, because I think the time is getting close, and I really wanted to throw this to the discussion, is that a lot of the challenges I see when we talk about this AI potential and geospatial reminds me a lot when I was at the World Bank and we were having very similar discussions for big data for official statistics. That whole discussion was about, hey, we have this new type of data that is really hard to understand, but is potentially extremely useful if we understand how to do it. And if we understand what is the trust issues and what are the skills needed for doing those things. The answer to that question is that we created mechanisms to understand that. There is literally a UN commission for using big data for official statistics. So what I would love to see, and I know that in the first panel, there was someone from the UN and a geospatial committee, it would be extremely useful to see if we can get lessons learned from the big data for official statistics in terms of trust, combining that committee of the UN with the geospatial committee that we spoke with and the AI committee. So that trialogue would be, I think, extremely interesting to understand how they do that, because a lot of the challenges are similar with one small and big difference, which is that big data was a new source of data, a new source of issues. AI is going to impact all the steps in the pipeline. So it's a little bit different, but fundamentally, a lot of the frictions to understand are similar to that case.
I think that answers, Hendrik, you had mentioned, can we learn from other, other applications, other data sets? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew has a question here.
Yeah, I just, Bruno, it's really, I guess I hadn't heard that idea before about using, essentially passing around vector embeddings like it was a data format. But if you actually apply it, it's really interesting because not only is it compression, but it also is a type of almost encryption. Because unless your embeddings are designed to be reversed, you essentially are saying, I'm going to share that some data exist, even if I'm not sharing the actual source of data. So imagine passing a whole bunch of photographs that maybe in the background have people that you don't want their faces all these things. You just are saying, I have photos of fires and I know where they are because that's the data I'm okay sharing.
Yep.
And you can find those, but I'm not going to tell you anything else. And I'm just thinking about that's one case with photos, but even thinking about, at least sitting next to census, the Title 13 around privacy, there's something around this idea about leveraging embeddings as a way to essentially make data searchable, like it exists, but being very selective on what metadata itself is actually shared to the person when they find that match. And just a lot of different applications that could be useful in. That's a really cool idea. So are there any, is this something like, would almost become like a opportunity for standards where it's like, rather than choosing one embedding model that everyone uses, right? More so just to say there's a standard around how embedding models could be passed around, and the API or standard has enough metadata to say, I'm using this embedding with these kinds of parameters so that as they're passed around fit for purpose, people can use as embeddings because they know it was, let's say, ChatGPT 4.0 versus Mistral, just to use two model examples. So
nobody knows.
Like, well,
yeah. My impression is that nobody knows. You and I and others, few others, because I know you are one of the 80,000 people. It's up to us to show the world what these basically semantic hashes can work and how to compute, how to make them only one direction. All of those things are up for grabs. And when I say up for grabs, I mean up for grabs for impact and business. Because of the nature of the omnipotential of the embeddings, they also make them very good for business proposition. So 100%, and it's up to us to make those specifications. But before that, it's up to us that is worth doing because it actually performs as we think it's going to perform. We don't know yet.
Well, I hate to stop this discussion, but I think we're going to move on to Keith is going to have some closing remarks.
So I have the privilege of being able to look back across the afternoon in this exciting discussion and attempt to pull some threads. I was remarking to some of my colleagues that I think the threads sort of weave themselves, so it makes my job much easier this afternoon. When we look back to the beginning of our discussion today, Kevin Pomfret, who from my perspective has thought more about the legal regulatory policy frameworks around geospatial data and information than anyone I know, starts with this talk about trust and trust being inherent in our everydays. This whole afternoon was born out of a discussion about what is authoritative data. And is that a capital A, is that a small a, and who gets to decide which one it is and how, and whose imprimatur makes something authoritative. And so Kevin implored us to understand that we don't go out and about our everydays on blind faith, but trust that there is this framework of system of laws and regulations and policy that is keeping us safe, that is pointing us in the right direction. He urged the geospatial community, as he has been doing for many years, to stop shying away from some of these thorny issues, but really push towards them. And that flowed quite naturally into Christine's comments, where she raised the idea and the concept of fit for purpose, and Andrew touched on that later as well, about being precise in our language when we talk about things. And what I heard is something I've applied in other places, is this idea that one size fits none, that easy frameworks and solutions, they're sort of like fast food. They're immediately satisfying, and then after a while, they're terrible for you, right? So she, too, like Kevin, said, we need robust processes, procedures, and frameworks that are the basis for facilitating that trust. Nicholas came in and actually, from my perspective, demonstrated through ESA how they have created a trust. They have created a bond. And he talked about his 3 C's, the continuity of data that supports that you can count on something coming, the connectivity and mutual reliance on one another that participants in ESA have been willing to commit to. And then that 3rd C is political commitment and programmatic commitment over the long term, so that you can trust in that. And the idea that I think generated immediately in the Q&A for that panel was as geospatial data and information becomes more prolific, more complex, the legal, regulatory, and policy issues, the really hard ones, the thorny ones, are sort of being left behind or, again, treated in a very superficial way. Nicholas pointed out that perhaps there are some corporate entities that are paving the way. They are solving some of these questions because they need to do it for their own success and profitability. So what can we learn from those that are forging ahead because they have a financial incentive to get it right? And that was during that Q&A that Kevin proposed. Perhaps there ought to be a legal working group attached to the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the FGDC. I was really struck then by a discussion about predictive Earth observations, right? And that really was important for me through the lens of the work that I'm participating in right now on FireSat. We believe that we will begin to understand wildfire in a way that we never have before, that we will be able to be predictive and not just reactive as relates to wildfires. But seeing it through Kevin's lens, through the lens of liability and what's authoritative and what data means that somebody should evacuate or some area should evacuate and some area ought to stay in place. How do we have a framework for assessing all of that? And that extended to digital twins as well. We're very excited collectively about the opportunity with digital twins. But again, Kevin likes to sometimes be the legal wet blanket that wants us to think more provocatively about what the implications are. We moved on to the next panel, evolving geodata and the role of AI, not because you're not able to have a discussion or panels these days without having AI in the title, but rather it was a natural follow-on as we understand how machines are going to process this ever complex, ever growing geodata bounty. And Raul talked about applying AI to NASA platforms and systems, and I really found it was interesting that he talked about doing it holistically, broadly, not trying to do, as we often do in the community, is build vertical solutions by spacecraft, by platform, by sensor, but really talked about it doing it horizontally. And that was best accomplished in his experience by open collaboration and an interdisciplinary team. I love the idea that he built a primer to allow people to assess foundation models for Earth observation. You've got to have critical thought, right? And this came up several times today. The ability to not just accept a model on face value, and we'll get to a little more of that momentarily, thanks to Gang Chen, but really being able to think another level in about what you're dealing with. And it's not just, well, am I going to use this model or that model, and without looking under the hood and truly understanding. The move to agentic systems and accelerating knowledge, and Rahul said this as well, to have this learning partner. And indeed, if that's going to be a learning partner who's going to be beside us as we look to create original works of research, then trust is indeed inherent in that. Andrew talked about millions of authoritative services. I mean, that's a scary sentence, right? It's less scary to not deconstruct that sentence. But the application of Geo AI across a broad set of verticals, he gave us some exemplars, but urged, right, that these data have to be discoverable, retrievable, usable, or it's just data, or it's just stuff that got collected and put away. It's like a book on a shelf. But looking through the lens of climate, weather, zoning, emergency preparedness, I think really was thought-provoking. And then Gang Chen, you really dug in. And the work that you're doing, I think, is so critically important. And I thought the way you constructed your presentation was excellent, right? Which is, hey, here's kind of the way we do it. And here are some of the shortfalls. Now, often that's where briefings end. Right? And you said, but I'm going to propose some solutions, right? This idea of spatial representation learning, which my note says that I saw that as an evolved approach, right? And then to take it through torch spatial and the idea of surfacing inherent geo bias, that's important stuff. The ability to quantify that, because you can't do anything about it if you can't quantify it. And so establishing metrics for geobias and understanding that some parts of the world are quantified and imaged more than others, and they're going to have a different weighting into current models. And at least being able to know what we don't know, really, really important. And I really appreciated your presentation. The idea of geospatially explicit data, right? That again, as I mentioned earlier in my non-question to the panel, is really what we need to be moving towards, because we've got to be more precise in our language, and we've got to be more precise in what we're doing, and have scientific principles be underlying our work, right? And sorting out the bias in the data versus the bias in the models, again, seems to me to be quite non-trivial. So good luck, and please keep at it. And then panel 3, Bruno's work, so critically important. I think it's really impressed me that he was able to go out and find generous funders who recognize the importance of that work and put the money into it, as have we been able to go, again, at Earth Fire Alliance and bring in to date $30 million from funders to allow us to understand and characterize and be able to act, not react, with respect to fire around the globe. So the idea that in an era where we have challenges with what governments are supporting, the work that NGOs are doing, the work that that we see through philanthropy, supported, at the very least started and launched out of philanthropy, perhaps to be picked up by others as it moves along. So I think when I think back to our earliest days, Kristen, and the rest of the committee members, and we talked about how we would craft today, I really think the journey really became quite rich and deep, and certainly from my perspective has given me a lot to think about as I leave today. So with that, over to Kristen, our fearless leader.
Thank you very much. So it's a wonderful day. And the one thing I have to say is I'm not going to go back as far as Andrew's clay tablet, the data on clay tablets, but, you know, I've been teaching GIS at Carnegie Mellon now for 31 years. And back when I started, you know, we actually had to digitize some of our map layers. We had a digitizing tablet where that's what we were doing. It's amazing where we've come. And I think that we did have one, I think, change that we should have had to our title. We called it Evolving Geodigital Data. I think it really probably is more evolving geodigital frameworks and processes, because we're at a point now where what do we do with this data? It's way beyond just creating the data. How do we use it? How is it going to be integrated into reaching? And I think Bruno said it nicely, you know, reaching the masses, reaching those that are unskilled. And we started to look at examples. Andrew had some of those, the one that you're doing with Firestat as well. So I think this is where we are now. And what do we do with this data? And there are going to be legal implications, and we need to talk about some of that. But anyway, so I want to thank everybody today who joined us, whether it was in person or on the live stream. This has been a very valuable meeting, and we all learned a lot. And I'd like to give a big thank to all of our speakers, as well as to everyone who asked questions and participated in this great discussion. As a reminder, you can sign up to get information on our committee on the website. This has been recorded, and it will be on our website as well. And just want to thank everybody again, and have a great day. Thank you.